The Committee of the Budget will come to order. Prior to beginning the hearing, there is one minor issue for the committee to consider. An activities report must be approved by the committee as required by Clause 1 of Rule 11. This report has been publicly available since June 27th. It recounts the actions and activities of this committee thus far this year. I now recognize Ranking Member of the Committee, Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the fact that you and your staff shared your activities report with us in advance of this meeting. It's simply a recitation of many of the committee activities to date. We've in turn provided your staff with a summary of the Democratic reports and legislation, which, as I understand, will be included in the committee report, either as a minority report or otherwise.
Yes.
So I just wanted to, with that, we're prepared to move on.
Great. I now move the committee adopt this report as the activities report of the Committee on the Budget for the first quarter of the 112th Congress. The question is on agreeing to adopt the report. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the activity report is adopted. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the report without objection. So ordered. The business meeting of the committee is concluded. We will now begin with the hearing as scheduled. I think our witnesses are arriving. Welcome to the reason everybody came here today. Today's hearing on the strategic choices we face in budgeting for our national security. I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Van Hollen, for requesting this hearing. We may differ over the appropriate level of defense spending, but we stand united in our commitment to America's security and a strategy-based debate when it comes to funding our military. Indiscriminate cuts in defense spending that are budget-driven and not strategy-driven are dangerous to Americans here at home and to America's interest in the world. Former Defense Secretary Gates put it quite well when he said, "That's math, not strategy." This committee has examined in depth over the last 6 months and advanced solutions to address the fiscal challenges that stifle job creation today, threaten the economic security of American families, and jeopardize our national security commitments as well. Our fiscal crisis is above all a spending crisis driven by the growth of our major entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, critical programs that help provide health and retirement security for millions of Americans. In 1970, these programs consumed about 20% of the federal budget. These autopilot spending programs now consume about 40% of the federal budget. Over the same period, defense spending has shrunk as a share of the federal budget from about 39% to 19%, even as we conduct an ambitious global war on terrorism. Clearly, defense spending is not driving our unsustainable fiscal path. There is, of course, considerable waste and inefficiencies at the Pentagon, which Secretary Gates did a great job of identifying. The House-passed budget builds upon this effort, devoting $100 billion of the savings to higher priority defense programs and $78 billion of savings to deficit reduction. We must work together to address the real drivers of our debt. We must advance solutions like those included in the House-passed budget that strengthen our social safety net, save our critical health and retirement security programs, lift our crushing burden of debt, and spur economic growth and job creation. America remains the greatest force for human freedom in the world has ever seen, lifting millions out of poverty and liberating millions from the shackles of terror and tyranny. Our leadership in the world is threatened by a fiscal crisis from within, and the stakes could not be any higher. It is critical for our national security and our economic security that we advance solutions that match the magnitude of the challenges before us. I thank our witnesses for joining us today and for bringing considerable expertise to help us frame the strategic choices we face. We have David Mosher. Did I pronounce it right? Is it Mosher? David Mosher serves as an assistant director for CBO on national security. We'll also hear from a former colleague of ours here in the House, former Senator Jim Talent, who is now a distinguished fellow at the Heritage Foundation and a member of the bipartisan panel that provided an independent assessment of the most recent QDR. Welcome back, Jim. It's good to see you. We also have Dr. Gordon Adams, a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center and a former national security budget official during the Clinton administration. The final point I want to make is this, a sentiment that I know Mr. Van Hollen shares. The men and women in uniform are not mere line items on a federal budget. Our budget debates must never lose sight of our solemn obligation in Congress to provide our troops fighting overseas with the resources they need to successfully complete their mission and our commitment to them upon their return. We owe a debt of gratitude to our military families that have taken untold sacrifices for our security and our freedoms we hold dear. I want to thank the witnesses, and I now yield to Mr. Van Hollen for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding these hearings. As you indicated, we requested a few months ago a hearing on the role of defense spending, security spending within the overall budget, as well as a hearing on tax expenditures at some point. And I thank you for holding the hearing today. I hope we can do the other one. And I want to join the chairman in welcoming all our distinguished witnesses here today. The Congressional Budget Office just released a new updated report on the Pentagon's current plans that concludes historical cost growth will continue to put upward pressure on the budget at a time of large deficits, and we'll hear more about that today. As Republicans and Democrats come together to work out a plan to get deficits and debt under control, we must get a better understanding of all the elements of the budget and continue to put pressure on the budget's bottom line, and what options we should explore to get the most out of every tax dollar spent. There is no higher priority than providing for the security of our country, and I join the chairman in expressing our gratitude to the men and women in the military who help keep our country strong. We all want a military that is second to none. But during this difficult fiscal period, we have to be much smarter and more efficient in how we go about providing for one. The economy, the source of our ability to provide for a strong security apparatus, is at risk because of large deficits and rising debt over time. Admiral Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, warned policymakers of this growing risk when he stated, quote, "Our national debt is our biggest national security threat." Over the last decade, the base Pentagon budget has nearly doubled, and spending at the Pentagon is now at its highest level since World War II. The United States currently outspends the world's second largest military, China, by a factor of 7 to 1, roughly $700 billion to $100 billion. And from 2001 to 2010, security spending, including Pentagon, the State Department, VA, and Department of Homeland Security, excluding emergencies and war costs, grew on average 1.5% per year more than non-security spending. Over the last decade, the Pentagon was able to avoid making difficult choices because of this permissive funding environment. This isn't my opinion. It's the opinion of the highest-ranking officer in our military. Admiral Mullen said, and again I quote, "With the increasing defense budget, which is almost double, it has not forced us to make the hard trades. It has not forced us to prioritize. It has not forced us to do the analysis," end quote. We can no longer afford to spend taxpayer resources without ensuring every dollar is efficiently and effectively invested. There is now bipartisan consensus that all spending, including spending at the Pentagon, must be on the table as we figure out how to get our finances back on track. Many Republicans have expressed their support for reviewing defense spending to find savings, including Governor Haley Barbour, former Majority Leader Dick Armey, former Senator and three-term Chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, Pete Domenici, and many others. Even in this year's Defense Appropriations Bill, Chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Hal Rogers, and Appropriations Defense Subcommittee, Bill Young, made the case that defense cannot be excluded from this debate. Others have proposed far deeper cuts to security spending. The President's Fiscal Commission, co-chaired by Democrat Erskine Bowles and Republican former Senator Alan Simpson, proposed more than $1 trillion in cuts to security programs over 10 years, including illustrative examples of how to save $100 billion per year at the Pentagon as part of a balanced plan to reduce the deficit. A majority of the commissioners voted to approve that plan by a vote of 11 to 7, including a number of Republican senators. Even in this committee, where agreement is hard to come by, the notion that all spending, including spending at the Pentagon, needs to be on the table was agreed to by a majority of the members this spring in sense of the House language. So where do we look for savings? We should look at all aspects of the budget, but the very first item to examine should be inefficiencies and wasteful practices. After years of trying, the DOD is still the one agency that can't pass a standard audit. It doesn't keep track of the number of service contractors. It is even though it spends roughly $200 billion a year on such contracts. Major weapon acquisition programs have experienced hundreds of billions of dollars in cost overruns in recent years. The GAO recently estimated cost growth of these weapon systems totaling $300 billion. And the GAO has identified a number of persistent high-risk management areas at the department that need improving. There are also seemingly endless examples of stories of abusive contracting practices. Last Friday, Leon Panetta was sworn in as Secretary of Defense, someone who was well prepared to deal with our fiscal challenge because of his vast security and budget experience. He released a message on Friday saying that a choice between fiscal discipline and a strong national defense is a false choice. I agree with the incoming Secretary of Defense in that regard. We can make both tough decisions to put spending at the Pentagon on a more affordable path and still maintain a military that is second to none. Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing. The Defense Department budget alone makes up approximately 1/5 of the entire federal budget and more than half of all discretionary spending, so I think this hearing is an important exercise in our oversight responsibilities. Again, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Van Halen. We'll begin with our testimony. I asked our witnesses if they could keep it to 5 minutes, and then they'll be able to expand on all their points in the Q&A. We'll start with Mr. Mosher, then Senator Talent, then Dr. Adams. Mr. Mosher, the floor is yours. And keep the put the mic right up to your faces.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Congressman Van Hollen, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss CBO's recent analysis of the long-term implications of DoD's budget request. DoD's plans are outlined in the Future Years Defense Program, or FYDP, for the 2012 to 2016 period, and in documents it's published on its long-term procurement plans. Because decisions made in the near term can have long-term consequences for the defense budget, CBO projected the costs of DoD's plans for its base budget, that is, DoD's budget without war costs, from 2012 through 2030. CBO has projected what it would cost to execute those plans using cost factors that are consistent with DoD's recent experience. CBO's detailed analysis was released last week and can be found on our website, but I want to emphasize that our analysis is intended to highlight the cost of executing the current plan. It's not an analysis of affordability or the requirements for defense, nor is it a prediction of likely actions taken by lawmakers. CBO's analysis yielded the following conclusions. DoD anticipates that the base budget will grow about 6% in real terms over the next 5 years, from $536 billion in 2011 to $569 billion in 2016 in order to execute its plans. I'm using 2012 dollars in all these in my presentation today. CBO, on the other hand, projects that funding would have to grow about 11% in real terms over that same period, or almost double what DoD estimates. In 2030, CBO projects that DoD would need a budget of $642 billion to execute its current plans, an increase of 20% in real terms over what you guys appropriated in 2011. The primary cause of growth through 2030 would be the rising costs for operation and maintenance, plus those for military personnel. In particular, CBO projects that there will be significant increases in the costs for military health care, military and civilian compensation, and various other operation and maintenance activities. If you could put slide 1 up, please. As you can see from the top line in slide 1 that's projected on the screen, it's figure 3 in the prepared statement. The O&M line, which is that top line, grows rapidly over the FYDP and beyond. In fact, it's the fastest growing of all those, a total of 42% growth from 2011 to 2030. The military personnel account, which is the next line down from the top, provides pay and most benefits to our soldiers, grows at about 26% over that same period. CBO projects that together those two lines would consume about 71% of the budget in 2030, up from 63% of the budget today, if DoD does not change the size of its force structure beyond 2016. In other words, the same force will continue to cost more and more every year. The growth in those two accounts represents the largest budget challenge to DoD in future years, particularly if defense budgets are cut below 2012 levels. I just want to point out, by contrast, the procurement account would grow rapidly through 2019, but then start to fall thereafter. Growth in the operation and maintenance account is driven in part by rapid growth in the military health system. More than 9 million active duty, reserve, and retired military personnel and their families are eligible for this benefit. CBO projects that the costs for the military health system will nearly double in real terms from 2011 to 2030, by far the fastest growing major component in DoD's budget. Compared to levels in 2000, costs will quadruple by 2030. if you could show the next slide, please. The figure on the screen, which is figure 4 in my prepared statement, illustrates the growth in CBO's projection. Rapid growth would occur in all categories in the cost in the military health system, except the cost of military personnel, which is that bottom category, which will grow much more slowly. The growth rates for military health system have been significantly higher than the rates in the national health care costs over the past 5 years, and CBO projects those differences will persist. For example, DoD spending per user for purchased and direct care grew at 3 times the national rate from 2006 to 2010. An important contributor to that increase are the accrual payments for TRICARE for Life, a benefit that Congress added in 2002. You can see the top category in the figure there in light blue. TRICARE for Life wraps around Medicare, significantly reducing out-of-pocket costs for beneficiaries who are eligible for both programs. They're generally military retirees and their spouses after reaching age 65. This leaves DoD with few tools to control these beneficiaries' utilization of services. It also has the effect of increasing Medicare spending as well. Once again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to appear before you and discuss our analysis, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank the gentleman. Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I remember the frequency with which I would read full statements when I was on your side of the table, and so I'm going to recap what I have to say and then make one observation, and then be happy to accept your questions and respond to them. In recapping my statement, let me give a little bit of a historical overview. I think that's the best way to do it. I came in the House in 1993, which coincided with the beginning of the post-Cold War policies and the peace dividend that the government took at the time. The force structure, many of you know this, was cut by approximately 40% across all 3 services. Procurement was at the time cut by even more than the force structure was cut. They took a procurement holiday. As I point out in my statement, there was 1 year when they didn't buy a fighter aircraft for the Air Force. The reasons for that was the assumptions that we would not have to put boots on the ground in the future, the assumption that for at least 10 years there would be no existential threat to the United States. These assumptions, by the way, continued mostly through the 1990s, and the assumption that by modernizing the platforms and modernizing the force, it would make each service member less vulnerable and more lethal and more capable so that we would be able to accept a smaller force and fewer platforms. And then modernization was cut in the 1990s. At the same time, as Bob Gates has pointed out, we found out that history hadn't ended. It had just thawed out with a vengeance, and deployments went up. Every president in the post-war era has sustained the commitments made by his predecessor and added to them. And that includes this president, who has sustained his predecessor's commitment, increased what we did in Afghanistan, and has now announced a responsibility to protect. And I don't intend to be critical of that. It just shows how busy our forces have been protecting American interests around the world. Then 9/11 occurred. Spending on defense did go up. But it was largely eaten up by costs that were generated by the decisions in the previous decade. Operation and maintenance has gone up, because when you increase deployments and you cut the number of platforms and you don't modernize, maintenance goes up because you're trying to keep legacy inventory in operation. Compensation has gone up. I think that was justified, but it was also necessary because when you put this kind of stress on a volunteer force, you have to pay people more. Well, the upshot is that chickens are now coming home to roost. We have kicked the modernization can down the road as far as we can, and now we have a force which is losing crucial capabilities. The Navy is the smallest it has been since 1916. The Air Force is the smallest and the oldest it has been since the inception of the service. The Army's missed several generations of modernization. The Army is not ready outside of the forces that are committed into combat. The tip of the spear is sharp, but they get that way by cannibalizing the rest of the spear. So if the balloon goes up someplace else, we're going to send in troops who don't have enough training and don't have the equipment, even the legacy equipment that they need. And that's why the panel, which you all created, which was consisted of people appointed by the leaders of Congress and the administration, the Perry-Hadley panel, and I mentioned this extensively in my remark, concluded that a train wreck is coming in the area of force capability because we have to modernize the force. Now we have a modernization crisis, and we have to increase the size of the Navy. That, in sum, is my remarks. I do want to add one observation. I know that the budget times are difficult. It is an unusually difficult time and maybe unusually difficult to do what could have been done any time in the last 15 years to put in the funds that are needed to modernize and recapitalize the force and increase the size of the Navy. But at least recognize that there's a problem. Don't, because you can't solve it right now, try and pretend that there is no problem. There's a problem. If you recognize that there's a problem, it gives a sense of urgency to doing the things that you can do. I mentioned in my written statement, for example, it would be a very good thing if we could increase foreign military sales, because the defense industrial base is very fragile now. Well, we can support that industrial base and carry some of these programs if we have more sales, but it's very difficult because we have an archaic system of approving these things. It takes a long time. You guys have probably studied it. Well, if you accept the fact that there's a problem and we need to do something about it, you will approach that kind of a reform with a much greater sense of urgency. CBO talks about the need to reduce the costs of military retiree health care. I would agree with that, and I think it is possible to do that without threatening the quality of that health care. We need to meet with the retirement community and their leaders, and we need to work something out. There's an urgency in doing that if you recognize that we are losing capabilities, air superiority, amphib capabilities, the ability of the Army to move quickly and move efficiently and effectively when it needs to. So there's a bunch of things that you can do. The other thing, if you recognize there's a problem, you can be opportunistic when the time comes. I've written in other forms about the stimulus bill. It was a decision to stimulate the economy by spending about $800 billion. I didn't agree with it as a matter of fiscal policy, but when I heard the government was going to do it, I thought, well, now here's an opportunity to address some of these needs. For about a third of that money set aside judiciously over 5 to 10 years, combined with the procurement reforms that we need, we could have taken care of this problem. Even if procurement and modernization had gotten the same percentage of that money that the DOD gets in any given fiscal year, we could have done a lot. Could have kept the F-22 line open. We needed to keep that line open as a hedge against the fact that the Russians and the Chinese are still building fifth-generation air-to-air superiority fighters. We could have bought F-18s as a hedge against the fact that you may not buy out the F-35 requirement. We could have gone to production of a higher rate production of the Virginia-class submarine earlier. Could have had the money available to reset the Army after these conflicts, and there would have been money left over. And I think had this body been conscious as a body, had we made the decision to recognize and confront the fact that there was a problem, there's a very good chance that that money would have been there. It would have been spent in American industries, high-paying American jobs, which was the logic behind the bill. But instead, there was no money spent on modernization and procurement, and I think that's because we didn't confront the problem. I think there would have been a greater sense of urgency last year about passing a defense appropriations bill. I'm not going to comment on that greatly, but you all know the failure to pass the bill and funding it through CRs did damage to the way the department operates, and that wasn't even a money issue. And I think there'd be a greater sense of urgency now, at least to try and do what Secretary Gates has said for several years needs to be done, which is to pass some budgets that have modest real increases in the defense budget, along with the savings that we're trying to get, so that we can at least stop the bleeding until the budget situation is resolved and we have more funds to address the modernization crisis. Look, I'll conclude by saying what I said in the statement. Yes, there's a price to strength. There's an upfront cost to it. There's a price to weakness, too. And we've been living with it. The reason that operation and maintenance budget is going up the way it's going up is they have to take care of legacy equipment that's breaking down. Some of it has mission-capable rates of 50%. So you're shoveling money in without getting the value because we've not recognized the problem and we've not committed ourselves to a solution. So I would just say at least, and I understand the situation that you're in, you have a very difficult job in the best of times. In these times, it's extremely difficult. At least confront the problem and at least approach with a sense of urgency the things that we can do. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Dr. Adams.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Van Hollen, for whom I am also a constituent. Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for asking me to testify today and talk about this issue. It is incredibly important work that you are doing. And I want to try to offer a perspective perhaps slightly different from either one that you have just heard about how we might go about doing that work. When I worked at the Office of Management Budget, which I did for 5 years actually in 1990s, would have been the 70s, 1990s, one of my bosses, who I think lurks behind that portrait over there in the corner, I'm not quite sure because I'm at an angle to it, would have been Congressman Panetta, who was the chair of this committee at the time, is now the Secretary of Defense. We struggled very hard with this issue of the relationship between defense and the rest of the federal fisc and the U.S. economy. And in the process of doing that, struggle in large part because we were constrained by the budget rules that were laid down in the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990, spent a great deal of time negotiating between the Office of Management and Budget and the Budget Committee, the chairs, the ranking members, and the members of the Budget Committee. So I'm very conscious of the important role that you play, and as we head into what Chairman Mullen called our most significant national security issue, which is dealing with our deficits and our debt, your role is going to become ever more important. I appreciate it and I understand it. Let me reassert then as my first point to summarize my testimony that our deficit, our debt, and the economy are our most important national security issues. I agree not only with Chairman Mullen, but with the Simpson-Bowles Commission, with the Rivlin-Domenici Commission, and national security is part of that issue. All spending contributes to deficits. All spending contributes to the borrowing we have to do to fund the deficits. All revenue changes contribute to deficits and to the borrowing that has to be done to make up and fund those deficits. And that includes national defense. It always has and it always will. The Congressional Budget Office and further work on their data by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities show that over the past 10 years and stretching out over the next 10 years, the deficits and the accumulated debt the United States have stemmed largely from three things. The tax cuts of 2001 and the reduction in revenue, the increase in defense spending, and the combination of revenue and spending increases that happened as a result of recession. A much smaller proportion of the deficits and the accumulated debt is attributable to the one-time TARP bill and to the stimulus package of last year, of 2009. So defense is part of the problem. All federal spending, all federal revenues are part of the problem, and that is why for you everything has to be on the table. Defense, point number two, is always resource constrained. We speak as if we lived in a universe where defense and resources were unlinked. One of the major weaknesses of the panel, in my judgment, that Senator Talent served on, was that it dealt with the world as if there were no resource constraints on any part of the federal budget, especially defense. But as Bernard Brody, a prominent strategic analyst, said many, many years ago, 1959, strategy wears a dollar sign. Resources and strategy are always linked. They will always be linked. In doubling the defense budget over the past 10 years, as General Admiral Mullen said, and Congressman Van Hollen referred to that, we've lost our ability to make the hard choices and do the trade-offs. Well, we've now, the piper who's playing the piping tune now that we have to pay is making those tough choices and doing the trade-offs that have not been done for the past decade. Third point, we are in a build-down. The build-down is already underway in defense. It is the fourth defense build-down that we have done since the end of the Korean War. This is not a new experience in American national security history. We have built down each time we have ended major involvement in a conflict, Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War, and now Afghanistan and Iraq. This build-down is driven by the end of those conflicts and by an increasing concern about our deficits and our debt. We managed a build-down in the 1990s. That build-down actually began under the George H.W. Bush administration. The first 500,000 people who came out of the military force structure were taken out by Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Colin Powell. We managed that build-down through the 1990s, and frankly, despite some of the issues raised by Senator Talent, it was in fact the best managed build-down we've had in American history and left behind a dominant global military force, one that took out Saddam Hussein like a speed bump in 2003. So it is possible to manage a build-down. We've done it before, we can do it again. Fifth point, in my judgment, the $400 billion over 12 years the administration put on the table is best the Defense Department is likely to do. It's a minimal. As I say in the testimony, we can achieve $400 billion in savings in defense over the next 12 years, providing the Defense Department with growth at the rate of inflation over that same 12 years, as against the current defense projected baseline. The commissions that have been mentioned before in introductory remarks, and we did the staffing on defense for the Rivlin-Domenici panel, have proposed more significant reductions. $500 billion to $1 trillion, which at $1 trillion comes to something like 15% of the projected resources over the next 10 years. It is possible to do a build down. We agree that if you reach numbers of those magnitudes, it's very important, as you suggested in your introductory remarks, to link it to strategy. And so in the testimony and in work we did for Rivlin Domenici and published in Foreign Affairs in January of this year, we've talked about what some of those priorities may be, and I hope we'll get a chance to discuss them more in the context of this hearing. Terrorism, obviously one, and we can talk about how one approaches that. It's not predominantly a military issue. Cyber protection is one, also not predominantly a military issue. Large-scale conventional combat, we judge to be relatively unlikely, not likely. The rise of China is an issue of serious discussion and serious consideration, but not manifestly a threat against which we need to throw a significant growth in defense resources. And most important, perhaps, in our view, the counterinsurgency mission, the dealing with fragile states using the military instrument. We would, in expanding the force to cope with that kind of a problem, we would be drawing the wrong lessons from Afghanistan and Iraq, not the right lessons, and I'm prepared to talk to that proposition. So we suggest in the testimony options that involve shrinking the American military force, dealing judiciously with our procurement vectors in the future. The Army, fortunately, has spent a good deal of money through supplementals over the past 3 or 4 years to help get ahead of the ball on its own reset problem, and to deal seriously with the problem of defense infrastructure. When we have more than 500,000 American combat forces, or I should say uniform forces, who are not in combat and do not deploy, according to the Defense Business Board, we have a serious problem of tooth to tail, and that tail needs to be dealt with in a serious way. Final point, and I'll close with this. It's important to point out that even if you took all of these steps, the United States retains today and would retain 10 years out a globally dominant military. We sometimes lose this point in talking about problems that the military has. We have the only military in the world capable of flying anywhere in the globe. We have the only military in the world capable of sailing anywhere in the world. We have the only military in the world capable of deploying ground forces anywhere in the world. We have the only military with global intelligence, communications, transportation, and logistics. The only military. No other country in the world even comes close. 10 years out, in a well-managed build-down, we would have exactly the same thing. Thank you very much.
And I thank the gentleman, and I thank the panel. Myself then for the first 5 minutes for questions. So I think I'll begin where the chairman left off, just one of his closing comments. I think it's very apropos. It says, "Our budget debates must never lose sight of the solemn obligation in Congress to provide our troops fighting overseas with the resources they need to successfully complete their mission and our commitment to them upon their return." And I think that is really what it's all about, what we're here right now. And I would say as well, in making sure that last line, our commitment to them, to make sure that they are able to have their safe return, and that may necessitate making sure that they have the resources, the training, and the equipment necessary so that they actually do come back safely. The first point, I just recently had the opportunity to look at some of the so-called top secret memos and what have you with regard to Libya. I won't reveal what I've learned there, but in the public releases on those that we received from the White House about a week or so ago with regard to Libya, the administration estimated that the cost of military operations over there through September 30th, so a month or so from now, will total approximately $1.1 billion. And I'm wondering whether you all have analyzed the basis for the administration's estimates in that regard, and if so, or how do you make those analyses at CBO?
Yes. No, we have not independently looked at that number. Those numbers are still rolling through, and we have not done a separate analysis of that.
Do you do a pre-analysis of that? Have you done any look at this that we can say, turn to you folks who we always turn to for these things?
No, we've been keeping track of it, and
Yeah.
we would be happy to take a look at it for you, but we have not, don't have anything to share with you today on a CBO analysis of those numbers.
Okay, and a last question on this then. So going forward, should we anticipate something from you, or do we need a specific request?
If you ask us to take a look at it, we'd be happy to do so.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
To some of the comments that Dr. Adams raised, but I guess it goes to the whole panel, and maybe goes to the congressman as well to begin with. So the Defense Department is said to be consistently over budget over the years, both in equipment procurement and in acquisitions. I understand, in fact, of the 92 major defense acquisitions, 75% are over budget, and 20% of the programs are over by budget by more than 50%. I wondered, first of all, whether the Congressman would like to speak about that issue, and then also back to CBO again, whether you have done any analysis, or maybe Dr. Adams has done analysis as why is that the case. And I've been here for 8 years trying to get some explanation from DOD on some of these things. So to the entire panel.
Sure. Well, I'll comment on it, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, we need procurement reform. I go into some depth anyway in the statement, and so does the Perry Hadley panel, and I think there are savings that can be achieved from that. I said before there was a price to weakness. Well, one of the issues when you're underfunding procurement and modernization over time, and particularly when you underfund it and then you're inconsistent with it as well, you contribute to, when I say you, by the way, I just mean the government.
Sure.
You're contributing to the driving up of costs. I mean, one thing, for example, normally the cost of programs go down as you buy them out, as you buy them in volume. Okay, well, yes, a DDG 1000 destroyer is going to cost a lot more per copy if you buy only 1 or 2, as opposed to the 32 that you originally decided to buy. And the reason why these programs, the numbers are cut back over time is because we don't have the money to go out and buy the requirements. So yes, the per copy cost goes up. The defense industrial base is capable of seeing the direction this government is going in. And when we're not funding these budgets adequately, they don't put a lot of money into the defense industrial base. We don't really have a military industrial complex anymore. If we do, we have a much smaller one than we used to. We only have 2 aircraft, at least prime aircraft manufacturers anymore. All of that has slimmed down. Well, a smaller defense industrial base that's undercapitalized, has less competition, and is less capable of producing these systems and these platforms at an efficient price. Now, there's a lot of things internal to the department. And, I mean, in my statement, what I said was, I think in an effort to bring down costs, and this is not a new thing, by the way. Every secretary that I served under wanted to bring down procurement costs, and Congress passed several pieces of legislation to do that. Typically, what's resulted is an increase in processes, the number of people involved in supervising these programs and the number of desks that decisions have to go through. And as we pointed out on the panel, what that does is it reduces accountability and responsibility within a chain of line management. So the answer is, if you're going to have more process, or the same amount of process, make certain that there are people designated to be in charge of the particular programs, that they have the authority, and that they are held accountable for what they produce. Another very important thing is to reduce the design build cycle, which now can be upwards of 20 years, to reduce it down to 5 to 7 years maximum, and just say, look, we're going to get the capability that we can get by producing these platforms in 5 to 7 years. We're going to get them in the field. We're going to get hulls in the water. We're going to get aircraft in the sky. We're going to get tanks and tracked vehicles on the ground, and then we will evolutionary upgrade over time. But part of the difficulty has been the funding lines.
I understand.
Let me comment on that, Mr. Chairman. Years ago, a very wise person in the defense procurement world, Norm Augustine, defined something called Augustine's Law. And Augustine's Law basically pointed on a trajectory, given the increase in unit costs of hardware programs, that would lead us by 2054, which now doesn't look that far away, where we would have essentially one airplane in the air capability of the United States military. And the Air Force would get it 3 days a week, and the Navy would get it 3 days a week, and the Marine Corps would get it 1 day a week, of course, the way it would work. And he was right. Augustine ended up being the chief executive officer of the Martin Marietta Corporation and a very distinguished defense industrial-based spokesperson. The problem in procurement goes way past this administration and way back in history, as Senator Talent has said. And one of the very effective pieces, I think, of the Perry Hadley report does talk about procurement. The problem is it's very difficult to fix. And it's very difficult to fix because the incentive structure is wrong. The incentive structure, both in the services and in the industry, is backwards from an incentive structure that would lead to the kind of efficiencies you'd want in procurement. For the services, getting a program into the budget is the top priority. If you get the program into the budget and get a program element 9 for it and begin the program, you then worry later about the fact that it's going to cost you more than you originally projected, but it looks cheaper at the start, and that's a way to get it into the budget. So the incentive is to get it into the planning process. For the industry, the incentive is to get the contract. So if you put the program in at a very cheap rate at an R&D level, you hope that make up that benefit in the procurement of the program when the dollars grow. So the incentive for the services is backwards, the incentive for the industry is backward, and the end result is we end up with what I call the Adams law of defense procurement, which is almost everything we buy costs us twice as much, takes twice as long, and gives us about half the performance that it should. And it starts with the incentive structure. It's very hard to change those incentives, even with powerhouse administration at the Pentagon. Even within the Pentagon, the incentive structure is to get it in the budget first. So it's an enormously difficult problem. Only one Secretary of Defense or Deputy Secretary that I know of has begun to even get a handle on it, and that's Dave Packard, who was Deputy Secretary back in the 1970s. And Dave Packard, who came from Hewlett-Packard, therefore had a lot of private sector management experience, managed to start to get his arms around the procurement process, and then, of course, like all senior officials, left office. So I've watched this cycle of reforming procurement go on for probably 40 years now. There's not a new idea in the barrel, and nobody yet has figured out how to get the right incentive structure.
We have not done independent analysis of this, but there is a very rich literature going back many years, as both the other witnesses have suggested, that suggests that it's 20 to 30% cost growth in weapon systems is, it's not an iron law. There are obviously many factors that happen. It's not a law of physics, but you have incentives. There are just many things that happen, including, DOD tends to buy weapon systems that are at the cutting edge of technology, which is always a perilous place to try to predict what costs are going to be. And so, that it's not always, although there are incentives that they talk about, well-meaning people can come up with estimates that turn out to be low when you try to deal with the reality of putting systems together. So there are a lot of reasons why costs of weapon systems grow. And as I said, the history is long. That's 20 to 30% on average for weapons systems cost growth.
There are examples of programs that they've done right or that they have fixed midstream. I mean, C-17 is an example. When Bill Perry took office, C-17 was a very troubled program, and he fixed it. And he did it through the kinds of procedures that we recommended. He took personal control of it. He took charge. He had the authority. He had the responsibility, and he was accountable, and he brought the plane in, under budget and on time. The F-18, the ENF is an example of a really outstanding program. That was an evolutionary upgrade,
right,
which points to the direction that I think we need to go in.
Right.
Well,
But you can't, again, we have to accept responsibility with the rest of the government, because when we have funding that is not up to the task, they feel they have to cram a lot of technology into the platforms that they are given. I'm concerned about this cargo tanker they're going to try, because they need cargo and they need tankers, so they're going to try and build a cargo tanker. Well, I hope they can do it, but if there are problems with it, it may be because they're trying to put two functions into one plane.
Well,
So I think there's responsibility in a lot of different areas.
I appreciate that, and just as I said, sitting here for 8 years, there's just a mountain of frustration of trying to ever be able to look to CBO or look to the DoD when they come here and testify to say, is this what we're really should be anticipating, and not another this year budget, out year 10-year budget. But I guess the commonality here is nothing's going to change anytime soon. Gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank all of you for your testimony this morning. Senator Talent, let me begin with you, because I was a little bit struck that in your testimony, nowhere do you mention the very important connection between the strength of the U.S. economy and the strength of our military. I assume you do not dispute the idea that the strength of our military flows in large part because of our strong economy. Is that correct?
Yeah, our economic wealth and prosperity has been many times in history a key aspect of our military strength. It goes the other way, too.
Absolutely. And do you agree with what the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mullen, said, that our debt is currently the largest threat to our national security? Do you agree with that assessment?
I think there are three. I think there are three, and I would not want to choose. I think the vital importance of getting back to sustained economic growth and job growth is hugely important. And in a sense, within the free market and the private sector, that the government wants that to happen and wants to encourage them to happen. I think the issues with the debt is hugely important. Now, and you guys are the experts, But to me, the core of that problem is the structural, and I'm going to try and state this as neutrally as possible, a structural mismatch between the revenue that's dedicated to the entitlement programs and the cost of the entitlement programs. And the rest of the budget, yes, it's a factor, but a minor factor. And then the third thing would be these national security challenges.
Right.
So I would say it's one of three.
All right. So I take it that you clearly disagree with the conclusions of the two bipartisan commissions with respect to defense spending and the importance of trying to address that issue as part of an overall strategy to strengthen our economy. Do you disagree?
Well, those are budget-driven analysis.
Well, I'll get to that in a minute, but if you could just indicate whether or not you agree with what Admiral Mullen said, which, and I quote, with the increasing defense budget, which is almost double, it hasn't forced us to make the hard trades, it hasn't forced us to prioritize, it hasn't forced us to do the analysis. Simple question. Do you agree with that statement by the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff?
No, I agree with his statements a few years ago when he suggested we needed to spend 4% of the GDP or we were not going to have a capable military.
Well, let me,
So, look, I don't see how we can say, if I can explain, I mean, I don't see how we can say hard choices have not been made when the service which he used to be the Chief of Staff is headed down to 210 to 240 ships, a level at which nobody believes will allow us to be a global Navy. I mean, if that's not a hard choice that's being made, he's retired ships, he and his successor chiefs have retired ships because the cost of maintenance was too high, and so the numbers of them is going down.
right. I think
that's a pretty hard
Senator,
choice.
What he's doing is, I think, strategy in the grand sense with respect to the situation we face with the deficit and the debt. You mentioned in your written testimony the rising power of China. Nowhere do you mention the fact that China is the largest foreign holder of our debt, and the influence that foreign entities can gain over the United States through the holdings of those debt. I mean, that's not raised there. Now, I couldn't agree with you more that the defense budget should be driven by strategy, not by budget. And Dr. Adams mentioned that. I think there's agreement on that. As you well know, you will find across the political spectrum very different views as to what needs to be done to make sure that the United States remains number one. From the Cato Institute on the more libertarian side to other think tanks on the left and everywhere in between. But I certainly don't dispute the basic premise that defense is our number one obligation and that it needs to be built off of strategy. The question is what strategy? And there I have to ask you, a number of times you've mentioned sort of pegging defense spending to GDP. My question to you is, isn't that just doing it by the math? Aren't you just saying, well, you are, aren't you? I mean, you're picking an artificial number. That's not driven by strategy, is it?
I'm actually glad you asked it because it gives me an opportunity to make a point. It's our belief at Heritage, and when we advocated the 4% for freedom, that was approximately what we needed. That percentage would produce what we needed in order to provide for the capabilities of the DOD according to a strategic-based analysis, because it would have freed up about another $40 to $50 billion a year that we could have put into modernization and procurement. The reason, though, that we phrased it in terms of a percentage of the GDP was to make an overall point, which I think is a point that maybe we can all agree on, and we ought to stop and think about this, because it's so easy on the Budget Committee to think of any expenditure of government as kind of an enemy that you want to reduce and as too big. Okay, let's go back and look at this strategically for just a second. You know, at the end of World War II, the leaders of the United States on a bipartisan basis changed strategically their approach to the world. They'd been playing a secondary role outside of the Western Hemisphere. That was a tradition in American foreign policy. Well, they recognized it had not been a success, that policy, in the first half of the 20th century. We had 2 world wars, and then we were entering a nuclear age, an age of asymmetric weapons, when another world war would just simply be intolerable. And so what they decided to do was to engage, to be more proactive, to manage risk and conflict instead of letting it get out of control, with a view towards achieving 3 baseline things: preventing the spread of totalitarian domination, protecting the American homeland, and doing that, I'm almost done, and doing that without a third world war. Now, here's my point to you.
Senator, no, let me because you've been on the other side.
One sentence?
No, look, I'm very familiar with that history. Really, I am. And my point was a pretty simple one. That I agreed with your assessment that military strategy should be based on strategy, not budgets,
Right.
and that there's an inconsistency with that in picking an artificial GDP number. Now, if what you're saying is you've looked at the strategy and your conclusion is that
That's right.
forevermore into the future, 4% is what's needed, there seems to be a little
Not
inconsistency
forevermore.
there. Okay.
But for the
Okay,
foreseeable
today.
future is what I
Okay.
thought, yes.
Dr.
It is.
Adams, Dr. Adams, if you could just expand on your testimony regarding the approach of the Quadrennial Defense Review and how you can do exactly what I think everybody in this room would like to do, which is make sure that we do have a military strategy that is based on making sure we protect our vital interests, but that we do it recognizing that the economy and the debt is also an important part of our overall strategy. And to talk about one without considering any of the other is to take a very narrow view over about what the power of the United States and how we project power and interest.
Yeah, I'd be happy to address that. The reality historically for the United States or any country in the world has always been that their resources and their strategy are linked. And that resources issue is not just budgetary resources. It's human resources, it's economic resources, it's the industrial capacity of the country, the productive capacity of the country, the trading capacity of the country. All of those issues are part of what any decent strategist would call grand strategy. It's not just about military capability, and we have had a tendency to focus just on military capability as what defines American leadership in the world. It's an important element. It's not the only element, and it's largely a supporting element to a broader sense of strategy. We also have a deficit in this country of thinking about strategy in the broader sense, so that when we produce strategic documents, they tend to be documents that come from the Department of Defense, which has typically and rightly a concern about the military capabilities of the United States, but becomes the dominant strategic thinker for the government of the United States. Stepping back and looking at our capacities as a country, stepping back and looking at the global situation we face, looking at our mixture of tools in the toolkit, civilian tools, military tools, trading tools, investment tools, all the elements that go into statecraft and grand strategy, is where the focus really should be. The major problem that I had with the Quadrennial Defense Review, and arguably with the Perry-Hadley report as well, was that it took too narrow a view of what strategy is. And it did so saying we must simply cover every single potential danger, risk, threat, challenge, or difficulty that the United States may face in the world and build a military capability to deal with it. The major weakness of the Quadrennial Defense Review, mirrored in the Perry-Hadley panel, was to say all missions must be fulfilled, all missions are equal, all missions must have reduced risk to zero. No country in the world has ever been able to do that. No country in the world will ever be able to do that. So every country measures its risks and challenges, evaluates what risks it's prepared to accept, weighs its defense commitments in the context of its broader domestic internal economy, its capacity to produce, its involvement in the global economy, the stability of its currency, its trading relationships. That's grand strategy. We haven't done that, and we've tended to be biased in terms of the military instrument here. Our view in doing work that we did for the Rivlin Domenici panel was to say, is there within a resource-constrained world, because it always is and always will be, a way of providing a scaling of the challenges that America may face on the military side that allows us to build capable military forces that retain the global superiority that we have today. This was, in other words, a strategy, not a numbers-driven exercise. Frankly, in my judgment, a share of GDP as a way of measuring defense is a totally numbers-driven exercise. It's math, not strategy. So we tried to tailor it to what do you do in the world? What is the appropriate role for the United States? How likely and unlikely and what capabilities do we need for dealing with nuclear challenges? How likely and unlikely and what capabilities do we need to deal with potential risks of conventional war and conventional deterrence? How likely and what resources do we need to deal with terrorism? What do we need in terms of capacity to steam the world's seas? What do we need to handle insurgencies in fragile states? And how important are all of those missions in terms of our overall security? for the United States, how much of them are really military responsibilities or the responsibilities of some other capacity in the U.S. government, which I certainly encourage this committee to take a good look at. And therefore, what is an appropriate level of expenditure and an appropriate level of forces that we would need to handle those challenges. And as I say, without exhausting you with the details on it at this point, what we came to was the conclusion that we would retain a globally dominant military capability with 15% fewer resources over the next 10 years than currently projected in the Department of Defense budget, that retains the capacity to steam the oceans, that retains the capacity to deploy forces, that would be a smaller conventional force, but more at the point of the spear than in the infrastructure, because that's how you'd have to rebalance that capability. And you can accomplish America's national security purposes for 15% fewer resources than currently projected. It is both math and strategy. And U.S. Budget Committee members have to deal with both those things, math and strategy. Math is important. Strategy wears a dollar sign.
I'll try to get in two questions quickly if I can. Mr. Mosher, can you recap for us, you pointed out the rapidly increasing price of health care on our military. Can you go through those metrics again quickly? And maybe we can get that slide back up as well.
Sure, certainly, Mr. Flores. See, if we could, it would be the second slide, if the slide, well, let me just talk to it. It's actually also figure 4 in the prepared statement in front of you. So, you can see that the growth is going to, from 2011 to 2030, roughly double in the military health system costs. That's what we have here. And the point I made before was if you look at the year 2000 to the year 2011, that was also, we've seen a doubling since then. Mm-hmm. Now, a number of those, a lot of that growth, if you look at the bottom 3 lines, which is the military personnel involved in the providing medical service and research, et cetera, and then the direct care, which is what's provided in the military treatment facilities, and then purchase care and contracts, which is the services that DoD purchases through contracts with private sector providers. Those 3 lines, have been with us for a long time. And what started to happen in after 2000, there were a number of benefits that were added. One, the big one is the TRICARE for Life accrual payments, and that's a big wedge there. But you also see that the direct care and the purchase care lines, the dark blue and the medium blue line, those start to grow significantly, and it is the growth that we see in the DoD experience over the last, we focused on the last 6 years because that's when a number of policies that were taken, new policies have sort of taken place, and so it's, if we do it much earlier, it's hard to do the measure. But that growth has been much higher, as I say, and in some cases 3 times higher than the national growth rates per user. There's been another factor in those numbers, and that is that you've seen an increase in the number of dependents and retirees who've come into the system, under 65 retirees. And so whereas in 2000, I believe the numbers were about 75% of those who are eligible among family members, dependents and retirees, that number has gone up to 85%. So you have more people joining the system.
I think you're making the picture pretty clear. In other words, we're creating obligations for people who aren't, or who have moved out of the military and aren't serving, and it's becoming an increasing part of our defense cost. My question would move to more somebody who's been on the front line of this, and that'd be for Senator Talent. What are your suggestions as far as what changes you would propose to try to mitigate the explosion of cost in this particular part of our defense budget?
Well, if you're talking about military health care, I think it's really important to meet and talk with the community of retired folks and talk about how you can provide the services that we are providing at lesser cost. And generally, I believe that's to try and make it a program where you're expanding their choices and therefore creating greater competition so that they will hold down costs. Mm-hmm. I think that's the way. Now, what I said in my statement was that I think the increase in compensation is fully justified by the performance of these individuals because they have preserved the peace They have protected our interests, and they've done it with a declining share of the federal budget and a declining share of the GDP. This is the point I was making. Rather than thinking of defense spending as a failure, we should think of what we have achieved at a small percentage of the GDP that has been declining basically over time.
I agree with you. I think many people have done a lot for very little.
No
as far as the
question.
percentage of GDP. I want to move on to another quick question.
The way it's structured now, we have too great an incentive for them to leave the service too early, and then we lose the benefit of their experience and training.
Right. Of their, one other question. You talked about the C-17 experience and what Bill Perry was able to do. And I have another experience, and that has to do with the USS Missouri, which was built by General Dynamics. It came in under budget, delivered 9 months early. How do we, it seems like those are more the exception than the rule when it comes to defense procurement. How do we inculcate those experiences into defense procurement more broadly?
It's a really good question. I personally think it's going to be easier to do. It will be easier to do on the aircraft side because you're producing higher volumes of platforms. And because if you just think of an aircraft production line as opposed to a shipbuilding production line, you're not moving as heavy or as big as stuff. I'd encourage, if you haven't done it and you have an opportunity to visit both lines, and you'll see. And that's why I think there are more successful experiments on the aircraft side. There are more contractors who've done really good lean manufacturing techniques and really perfected it and gotten us platforms at low per copy costs. I think shipbuilding is going to be a bigger challenge. But if we can, if on the government side it can say, look, this is the kind of funding we're going to provide. It's a reasonable funding in terms of the kind of ships that we expect. We're going to have to do a lot more in terms of shipbuilding if we want to protect the size of the Navy. And then set targets for them and hold them accountable. And supervise them with small groups of empowered people within the DoD. And avoid what both my colleagues here have been talking about, requirements creep. You can't do everything with every platform. So get hulls in the water. And I think you can make it better over time, but there's no substitute for senior people taking responsibility and being accountable for the outcome. Read my, there's a quote from John Lehman in my statement, which is very interesting because John points out, in World War II, we had 1,000 people in the Shipbuilding Bureau. We produced 1,000 ships a year. When he was Secretary of the Navy, I think we had 2,500 people, and we were producing like 20 ships a year, something like that. Now we've got 4,000 people. We're producing 6 ships a year. And it's because it's not because they're not good people. It's the confused authority and accountability.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman.
back.
Thank the panel. Ms. Schwartz. Gentlelady, you're on the list.
I'm happy to go. I'm happy to go. All right, sorry. I was
If
being
you want to use
very
it, it's up
polite.
to you.
No, I'm happy to to go ahead. Well, I really appreciate some of the conversation we're having, and I think it's an incredibly important one to have. So thank you to the ranking member for asking for this hearing and for us being very attentive to, I think, what are really 2 issues. We've talked around some of them and talked at some, but one is that certainly on this side of the aisle, but I think all of us agree very strongly that we are first and foremost committed to a strong defense, to being prepared for any future, current or future concerns and threats to our nation, and that is our number 1 priority as members of Congress and as a nation to be safe and secure. Secondly, we are very concerned about the debt and in reducing the deficit, and are well aware of the fact that the Department of Defense is a good chunk of our budget. I think you've talked about how much it is. It is 60% of our discretionary budget. And we spend a lot of time on this committee and in other committees focusing on 12% of our budget, which is the non-defense, non-security, discretionary budget. And yet every external expert, and many of us, I think both Republican and Democrat on this committee, feel very strongly that everything has to be on the table. We took a vote in this committee when we were doing the budget, and there was strong support, bipartisan support, for including Department of Defense in our call for greater efficiency, greater accountability in the use of public dollars, and in helping us to be able to reduce our deficit. And in fact, ignoring the Department of Defense budget and taking it out of this process, which for long, as I understand it, we often have done, sort of anything you want, no accountability, for the way they spend the money has really hurt us, and it will hurt us in the future if we ignore the Department of Defense. To me, it seems, maybe this is unfair, but just completely unacceptable to not have the Department of Defense be a part of helping us reduce the deficit. And what we're talking about is some of the things that Mr. Mosher, you've talked about and Dr. Adams talked about, which is demanding greater efficiency in what they do, and simply in procurement, not simple, but in overhead. And do we need this many administrators? I mean, do we need in the rank in the Department of Defense, do we need, how many supervisors do we need, how many senior officials do we need to be watching the store that actually still can't tell us how many subcontractors they have, how many contractors they have, what they really spend on procurement? Can they not reduce their costs by 1%, 2%, 3%, 4%? Talent talked about wanting to shift that money into other ways of doing things. I think there's been some discussion about wanting to modernize our forces and modernize our purchasing of equipment. I think many of us agree with that. But my real question, and I will, two areas really simply, is you talked about some of it, but asked Mr. Mosher about the efficiencies. Simply, how can it not be possible to get greater efficiencies out of this larger system? These many dollars to demand that. And my second question, and it may be for either you, Mr. Mosher or Dr. Adams, to address very briefly the issue of healthcare costs. And we've been very hesitant to go this direction because of our commitment to providing quality healthcare for our active military. But in fact, we're calling on the entire healthcare system, certainly under Medicare and Medicaid and maybe in the private system, to do greater efficiencies and to improve quality and coordination and reduce costs in that way. Can we not do that in a system we actually have more control over, if anything, which is the military one? So in 1 minute or less, if you would just comment on those two areas, that would be very helpful. Mr. Mosher.
Just very briefly, we did not analyze efficiency in our piece, and we haven't looked at it carefully, but obviously there are always places to get efficiencies, but I'd be hesitant to speak about the magnitude that you could get from them. As to healthcare, I think I've shown the growth, and one of the points that I wanted to make when Mr. Flores was asking the question was, one of the reasons you've seen such growth, well, there have been twofold, is that the military healthcare system, as other health plans have become more expensive, the military system, for those who have a choice, has seemed a cheaper and cheaper option over time. And so you've seen much more of people moving into the system. And just to give you an example, for retirees, for example, that is the under 65 retirees, for their, according to DOD's numbers, their out-of-pocket expenses are about $900 a year for a family in that system. So you pay your premium and then you're out-of-pocket as your copays that haven't really been adjusted since the early 90s. And if you compare that to someone who has health care in the private sector, their out-of-pocket expenses are roughly $5,500 a year. So it's $900 versus $5,500. It's a factor of what, 6. That would be one way if you were trying to get the cost of the system under control. It would look at that sort of thing. And CBO has done, we do this annual volume every year that look at options for reducing the budget. And we have several options in there that look at healthcare as things you might do to try to control the cost of healthcare in DOD's system.
I believe we're out of time. I don't know whether we would permit Dr. Adams to make a comment about
just very
the
briefly.
efficiencies would be great.
Yeah, just 2 points, Congresswoman. The efficiency question is usually subsumed in the phrase waste, fraud, and abuse. It's not really there's not a line item in the Defense Department budget called waste, fraud, and abuse. It is, in fact, an extraordinarily large infrastructure. Everything the U.S. government does, anywhere that it does it, is done in the Department of Defense in miniature. Every function is performed in the Defense Department, and we have created an unbelievably large infrastructure to do it. It's now, the infrastructure, the Pentagon estimates, is 42% of the budget. There are 340,000 people doing what are essentially commercial functions. There are 560,000 uniformed forces who never deploy because they're involved in managing the infrastructure. We have probably the worst tooth-to-tail ratio in terms of combat forces at the point of the spear and infrastructure behind it of almost all of the industrialized militaries in the world, according to McKinsey. It is a huge, huge problem. CBO, I think, in the report that Dave Mosher referred to, rightly targets infrastructure, or rightly targets O&M as an area of concern, because that's where most of this is buried. It's somewhere buried in the civilian payroll in O&M, which is 40% of O&M. It's buried in the functions that they are doing. And it's very hard to get your arms around it. And so I encourage CBO to do more arm getting around in this subject, because it will help us to decipher exactly what's going on here. But the rate of growth in O&M is about 1.5 to 2.5% per year, whether you like it or not. Right. And the only way that it comes down, and I think this is important to note, is the way budgets come down is they come down, which sounds just like a tautology. But the reality is, when you set a lower budget level, it induces a level of efficiency. Usually efficiency doesn't happen bottom up, because people are used to doing business that way. When at the top the services say you will have less for base operating expenses, be more efficient, people find ways. And we did find this in the 90s. One of the healthy effects of the build down of the 1990s was that in lowering the defense top line, choices had to be made. And the choices can be very efficient when they come from the top down. So budget constraint and budget discipline is an important element in inducing efficiency in operations and lowering the infrastructure cost.
Changing the culture. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That actually ties into the question I was going to ask. Let's stay on this topic of the infrastructure and the efficiency, because coming out of the private sector, one of the first things I would try and do if I wanted to get my arms around any particular situation is try and get as much data as I could about it. And in my world, that might imply an audit. And you heard the ranking member, I think correctly so, identify the Department of Defense as either one of or the only major agency that has never been able to audit itself or have an audit performed on it. I think I've heard even that the Defense Department claims it is beyond an audit, that it is not able to be audited. And I guess my question to you, gentlemen, is should we tolerate that? And if the answer is no, because I think the answer should be no, how do we fix it? How do we at least start the process of fixing what we seem to recognize here as a problem without getting the information? How do we audit the Department of Defense? And I'll throw that open to anybody.
More yours, I think, isn't it?
Well, we're not auditors, so I wouldn't presume to tell you how you should audit. No, we're count the budget, but we're not auditors. That would be, GAO would be probably the auditors. I mean, I will say that on the O&M question that Mrs. Schwartz raised, one of the challenges is getting good data on O&M, and that Gordon raised. It is very difficult to get good data on operations and maintenance spending. While we get the data that DoD provides to us. So I'm not saying that it's impossible to get good data. I'm saying that the data that we receive, that we, the Congress, receive on operations and maintenance is relatively limited, and it makes it difficult to dig into the very complicated things that go on in the O&M account. One of the problems that we have, and we have a study that we released in, I believe, January, where we looked at some of these issues, but it was largely, we had difficulty doing it in large part because once supplemental money is appropriated for the wars, when you start looking at what DoD has now actually spent on O&M, those monies are commingled. So it's very difficult to separate what war effort money would be. That is, the very legitimate things that you need to be doing to fund our soldiers and airmen and sailors overseas fighting wars, to what DoD needs to do in its day-to-day, in its base budget. You know, the activities it gets to get those forces ready, to train the forces, to develop weapons. And it's very difficult to separate those monies once they've been commingled, because DoD doesn't track it that way. So, and we have some recommendations where we talk about some ways to do it, but it's not about auditing. That is, we didn't take it that far. What we did was we looked at the potential where additional money, additional information would help the Congress in trying to understand that O&M account. And just so you know, we are also doing a study at the request of the House Armed Services Committee where we are looking at how DoD models the requirements that, how it comes up with its budget for operations and maintenance, operational readiness specifically. And so we've gone to all the services, and we're in the process of doing that and should have something on that in the fall.
I think the department absolutely ought to be tasked to improve its auditing performance. Now, I will just tell you, the O&M budget is not going to go down as long as we have an inventory that's this old, because they're having to spend the money to maintain it. I'm sure that we can reduce some of the combat service support personnel. Yeah, you don't have to have the guy in uniform taking the tickets at the movie theater, but then you're going to have to hire somebody privately to do it. I mean, Congress is going to have to authorize privatization, by the way, too.
Let me press you on this point, because I think you and I generally philosophically would agree on a lot of things. But as a conservative, how can I in good conscience even contemplate this 4% for freedom concept? How could I even contemplate plussing up any defense spending until I solve each and every one of the issues that Mr. Mosher just addressed? How can I in good conscience go to the taxpayers and say, listen, I want to spend more money on defense, when I don't have any clue how the money that we're spending now is being spent?
Because there's a tremendous connection. In the first place, we ought to get to savings. And that's what the Perry Hadley Commission said. That's what Heritage says. That's what I say. And then you're going to have to devote it to recapitalizing the inventory and modernizing the accounts. If you don't, you are going to generate huge extra costs that are going to swallow anything that you have saved. And that's been the history of the last 15 years. We predicted in the 90s that the O&M accounts would go up precisely because of this. And while there's a connection between the economy and military preparedness, there's also a connection between military preparedness and the economy. If we are weak and are perceived as being weak around the world, it increases the level of instability and risk, which decreases economic growth. I gave an example in my testimony. The United States maintaining stability in the Northwest Pacific around the Korean Peninsula has prevented a war there for the last 60 years. How good has that been for the economy? And the increasing instability last year in the Western Pacific, as China started throwing their weight around, was not good for economic growth. Caused a lot of issues among our allies. That's a hugely important part of the world. So you have to recognize the connections. But yes, let's get the savings. What we're saying is, realistically, there is no way that Secretary Gates has talked about $15 billion a year he hopes he can get. They've been trying to get this for 15 or 20 years. I'd love to get that. It's not going to be enough to do everything we need to do. We don't even have a new bomber program planned, and we're flying 50-year-old bombers. Remember, decisions you're making now are going to affect what this force structure is 10 or 15 or 20 years from now. Our guys are going to be flying 70-year-old bombers. And that's not consistent with the United States protecting its security.
Mr. Adams, I apologize. I'm out of time. I'd leave it to the discretion of the chairman, but thank you, gentlemen.
Over to the chair, whether he wants me to answer or not. Briefly put, we believe that this begins with mission discipline, and one of the things that's striking about the conversation so far is that there's not been much discussion about mission discipline in the Department of Defense. We recommended with the Rivlin Domenici panel that we take 100,000 people out of the active duty force structure solely in infrastructure positions. Now, for those who then say, well, then you're going to have to hire contractors, you're going to get some civilian to do it because you're taking out of the combat force. No, it's linked to mission discipline. If we tell the military, here are the things that are important, here are the priorities, here's the thing you're going to do, you are in fact going to need less infrastructure to do it. But my bottom line here is you start the process of eliciting the data you want by imposing budgetary discipline in the areas where you want that budgetary discipline imposed. And O&M is one of the key areas to impose that discipline. So some of this has to happen through leadership, top-down decision, and mission discipline that says you are going to require less infrastructure to perform these missions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Senator Talent, have you been employed by or served as a partner in the Fleischman Hillard or Mercury Communications?
I was, and with Fleischman Hillard, and then there was a corporate reorganization, and it became Mercury, which is a sister company within the Omnicom umbrella.
Because I have a release from Fleischman Hillard that says the firm's area of focus is the defense and aerospace industry. And by the firm's own description, and I quote, we leverage our long-standing relationships with industry influences. And I assume with something like defense, those influences include us members of Congress. So the firm's stated aim here is to help defense industry firms and I quote, "win new programs and keep existing projects." So, Senator, is it, as serving as an independent arbiter on the QDR review panel, is it fair to say that either through your work with Fleischmann-Hillard or with Mercury in the past, that your job was to advance defense as an industry?
No, not in that. We have defense clients. I offer strategic advice from time to time. I don't lobby. My views on this subject date back to 1993. Everything that I've said and done here is consistent with what I said and did entirely in my career, including when I was in public life. So this is not something that I've come to lately when I took this position. Anybody who knows me knows that through 3 different administrations, Republican, Democrat, I have been consistently concerned about underfunding the military, and I have criticized on a bipartisan basis policies that I thought contributed to that.
Right. And the fair to state, I believe, though, that their efforts here are to advance new programs and keep existing projects that firm up investment in defense. With the acquisition of weapons systems, having been the area of inefficiency and cost growth at the Pentagon, I would like to focus on in recent years that this area has been particularly egregious. The GAO recently estimated that acquisition costs for the Pentagon's major defense programs grew by some $300 billion, or 25% above initial estimates. The GAO cited 2 main reasons for that growth. First, that DoD's processes for funding programs create, and I quote, "an unhealthy competition for funds that encourages sponsors of weapons system programs to pursue overly ambitious capabilities and to underestimate those costs." So we have a systemic problem that encourages private contractors to feed us technology of debatable utility for an unrealistic price. Second reason GAO cited for that phenomenal growth rate in acquisition costs is that the Pentagon's process for acquiring weapon systems allows, and again I quote, "acquisition programs to proceed through key decision points without sufficiently reliable information on funding, schedule, and technology upon which to make sound decisions." So I would ask the panel, do you agree with that assessment, and do you think that recent reforms to DoD's acquisition system adequately address these causes? Mr. Mosher?
We have not looked at, that is not an area that we tend to examine. But I did want to, Mr. Garrett, you did ask a question earlier, and I was remiss in saying that in our estimates in this work that we did and the estimates we always do, we try to use those cost growth figures to estimate what costs will be. And so we try to capture historical cost growth in the systems that we estimate, but we have not done independent analysis of the causes of these sorts of things.
I would say yes and no. Yes, there is a problem with them acting either on the basis of not enough information. I would say, though, it's more a question of there are too many people trying to get the information and nobody's accountable, and no, they have not done enough to deal with it. On the issue of infrastructure and particularly personnel, as personnel costs have grown, the chiefs in particular have made every effort to reduce the number of personnel in their services because they don't want to, they want to get the platforms, they don't want to pay for the people. And particularly the Air Force and the Navy, I think, reduced too far, which is why we now have a process, for example, where we have to cross-deck sailors. Sailors coming in from one task force, or steaming in from one or helicopter to go on another task force that's going out. Because we don't, they have had an incentive to try and reduce personnel. And where they could do it, they've done it because they've been trying to protect other parts of the budget.
Thank you, Dr. Adams.
The question, the last part of the question is the one that I wanted to address, which is have the current reforms, are the current reforms likely to get a handle on the problem that you've described? And the honest answer is it's too early to tell. My analysis of those proposals is probably they're too weak to have such an impact. I see nothing in the data so far, and GAO provides the most compelling data that we have on cost growth. Nothing in the present data suggests that the overall judgment that I have about the ability to control procurement costs has been fixed by any of the current procurement reforms. It's really tilting at a windmill because the incentive structure is wrong.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony today. And Senator Talent, this is a little surreal for me. Back in 1995, when you were chairman of the Small Business Committee in the House side, I was sitting on that side giving testimony while you were at the chair.
Well, try and be as gentle with me as I'm sure I was with you.
Yeah, I remember. The question, I really would like to address it to you.
Mosher said, on the other hand, turnabout is fair play.
Yeah, okay. I'd like to ask the same question to you and to Dr. Adams. One of the things that intrigues me is it seems a little bit like we're continuing to defend our country as if we're in the very close post-World War II era. We have tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of troops stationed in safe harbor nations like Germany and Japan and other places around the globe. Are those numbers appropriate given the speed in which we can move people about the globe and equipment?
Well, the bases, first of all, with regard to base closure, we did a number of rounds of domestic base closure. I voted for all of them, and I'm not sure you guys would know. I mean, have they actually determined that we saved any money? And I don't know that we've acted, because we have to invest upfront costs in closing a base. Now, the bases are there to help us get in and out of places. We could not have done what we've done in Iraq and Afghanistan without the bases in Kuwait and Qatar. If you don't have those, we wouldn't have, if we didn't have the troops or the bases in Germany, we wouldn't have a place to evacuate the wounded. You know, it's pathways in and out. So if you don't do that, and I think we should be constantly looking at infrastructure, but understand that we're still going to have the ability to get in and out.
Yeah, and I'm not really looking at infrastructure per se. I'm looking at troop count.
Well, I mean,
A lot of military personnel.
I
in
guess
Germany.
they have tried to reduce, in fact, have in Europe and in Korea, they've reduced footprints. I mean, again, these are not people who have tried to have more personnel, because over the years, this is why I simply dispute the idea they haven't made hard choices. They've made a number of hard choices. I can submit you a huge list of them. I don't have time, I guess, to talk about it, because they've been under increasing budgetary pressure. So you have to maintain the bases, or you have to substitute something for them, which is forward. You can operate off of naval vessels, then you need a bigger Navy. Or you need more cargo lift. Well, you can't shut down the C-17 line, because you got to get the people and the power from here to there one way or another. So it's not my sense that you're going to get a lot out of the foreign bases or reducing those footprints. It may be possible, and if you can, you should. But I just don't, I'd love to tell you there's some silver bullet that you can get out of the rest of the budget. But look, the budget's O&M, that's going up. The budget's personnel, he just said that's going up. It's overseas contingencies. Maybe that'll go down. But remember, even if the drawdown in Afghanistan is successful, and I certainly hope it is, we're going to go back to 60 to 70,000 troops, which is almost twice as many as we had when the president took over. And I'm not saying he's wrong in doing that. The idea we're not going to do counterinsurgency, I mean, I don't know how you can draw that conclusion given what we've done the last 20 years. That leaves procurement and modernization, basically. So if you pressure them, it's got to come out of procurement and modernization, which is where it's come out of. One other point I want to make about the overall budget picture. Everything should be on the table. Defense has been a declining portion, both of the GDP and the federal budget, which is why I said in the statement, if you resolve the broader issues between the mismatch between revenue and entitlement programs, there's going to be enough money to pay for defense. If you don't, not funding these basic requirements is not going to keep the government from going bankrupt. I think that's just a statement of fact.
Okay. Dr. Adams.
Yeah, a couple of points to make. First off, in the work that we did for the Revlin Domenici panel, we explicitly come to the question that you asked in the narrowest sense. That is to say, there are areas where the United States has forward deployed forces where one can, I think, safely say those forces could be reduced, not eliminated, but reduced. And Europe is the biggest one of them right now, at about somewhere between 80 and 100,000, depending on how you count naval forces. And you probably could bring that down to, 20 or 30,000, where you'd be operating the health infrastructures at Ramstein and places where you need capacity because you're doing deployments elsewhere, and not have the forward deployed combat forces that you have there today. And in fact, the Defense Department is considering bringing a brigade combat team out of Europe. We'd say 2 brigade combat teams could safely come out of Europe. The deployment in Asia, we also think could come down in terms of the ground forces specifically. It's not a large presence, but we wouldn't bring it down as heavily as we would in Europe because the security situation is less certain in the Asian theater than it is in the European theater. But in ground forces terms, we're unlikely to be using those ground forces in areas where we think they're deployed forward to be used, largely Korea. We're certainly not going to a ground war with China. So there is opportunity there. The reality in budgetary terms, is, of course, is that you don't save any resources unless you bring down the size of the force structure to match. So if you actually bring forces down and attrit the force structure so you match the numbers that you've brought back. It may not be the same people, but it may come from somewhere else. You can easily do that. Let me address one other question that was raised or implied by your question, and that is this question of counterinsurgency. I want to come back to that because it's maybe the first time in this discussion so far that we've really addressed a strategic or military mission-related issue. And I think there's a very important argument to be put on the table here that we have not in fact been conducting major counterinsurgency operations for the last 20 years. We have been conducting them for the last 10 years in countries we did not invade because of insurgencies. We invaded those countries because we had a regime change prospect in mind, explicitly. That was policy. Remove Saddam Hussein, remove the Taliban. We inherited an insurgency in part stimulated by the capability they would put in there to remove a force in a country that did not have a fragile government. The reality is we are not going to fight insurgents around the world. We are going to choose where we fight. We are going to choose where we deploy forces. There are areas with major battles raging today we wouldn't dream of deploying American military. Democratic Republic of Congo comes to mind, for example. That we will not engage in counterinsurgency warfare on a global basis because no sensible president is going to decide that it's America's military mission to fight whatever an insurgent is, wherever he or she is, somewhere around the world. So it strikes us, at least, and this is part of our strategic analysis for Rivlin and Domenici, that the counterinsurgency, nation-building, global policing role with ground forces in a lot of countries doing something called counterinsurgency is a very unlikely future mission for the American military. It is, if you will, the wrong lesson of Iraq and Afghanistan. We are unlikely to do 250,000 person deployments in a counterinsurgency mode somewhere else in the world.
Thank you. You yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Talent, I just want to follow up on a line of questioning that Mr. Tonko had started. And this really isn't about credibility, but I'm just confused about something. Because, as you said, the views you expressed today have been long-held views, and this is somewhat of a chicken and egg situation. But it goes to also kind of the revolving door that we have these days. I assume that one reason you were retained by the people who pay you is because you held these views, and
No, I mean, the reason I was retained was not because of any specific view in any particular area of public policy, but because of a perception that I understood how the Congress operated and could give good strategic advice to clients who cared about that, and very little of what I've done over the years has been related to defense. It's mostly in other areas, healthcare, regulation, that sort of thing.
Well, and you tried to make a distinction. I just asked you to explain, because to me, it's a distinction without a difference. The fact that you're not lobbying, but you are being paid for.
No, I was just explaining what I do. I mean,
Okay.
I thought the question went to what I do, and I just fleshed it out.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much. Again, your views are your views, and I accept that.
It really has gone back 20 years, and it's really, whatever else I've done, this has been very bipartisan in what I've said, and I believe very strongly that the views that I hold are necessary to a successful foreign policy, no matter what point of view you're coming from. I wrote an article in 2009 at great length about this, advising that these needs be taken care of in order to make the incoming president's foreign policy successful. And I bet that he wishes right now that he had increased some capabilities when he had that stimulus bill in front of him.
Well, that's water under the bridge, unfortunately. Following up a little bit on the foreign presence that we have, and I know this differs from country to country, and I would address this to you, Mr. Mosher, first. To what extent do foreign countries subsidize our presence there? Is it a significant factor or not? And is that an opportunity, perhaps, to write the budget a little bit?
You know, this has obviously been a very difficult political issue for a long time. There was long debates about burden sharing within NATO and in Japan. And, you know, there's also this problem with you're not asking, or nor do you want to ask foreign governments to pay for our forces themselves, right? That wouldn't be right. So it tends to boil down to infrastructure and you know, paying for bases and paying for those. And there are varying degrees of support in different countries. And I said Japan and NATO being the most advanced. That is the most well developed. You you know, that ends up being a political decision that a president and a Congress and another country has to make about supporting that arrangement. And you know, every country's different. Yes, there are potentially some savings if you were to do it, but you know, it's not going to solve our budget deficit problem.
Dr. Adams, you mentioned earlier in your prepared testimony that you would like to have the opportunity to discuss some other recommendations that the Quadrennial Commission had come up with, ways we might do things. I'll give you the remainder of my time to to talk about a few of those if you want.
Well, let me come back for a moment to this question of mission, because I think a strategy-driven conversation is in order at this point in our history. The major critique that I had of the Quadrennial Defense Review that we had, and one of the major critiques that we had of the Perry-Hadley Commission, was the real failure in both cases to say some threats are more likely than others, some missions are more likely than others, and some elements of risk are more acceptable than others. Any good strategist will tell you that calculated against resources is exactly what a strategist does. He says, what are we likely to do? What are we less likely to do? What's not likely to happen? How much do we really need to hedge? We have precious little guidance from either of those exercises to do that, because both of them were consciously developed independently of any sense of limitations on resources. The consequence is really weighing, for example, what the likelihood of the use of combat forces is going to be in Europe, and what one could then reduce the force in Europe as a result has not been done. The real weighing of the likelihood of a major ground warfare in Asia has not been weighed. It won't happen against China. We'd be mad to go into a ground war in China. It might happen in Korea, but the Korean capability that exists in South Korea is vastly different from what it was that we faced in 1950 when the North Koreans came across the 38th parallel. You know, where you're going to face conventional forces, where are we going to deploy 250,000 in a conventional mode? And if you start weighing the cases and saying, is it Iran? Unlikely. Is it Pakistan? 160 angry Pakistanis coming at our military force is not a prospect I think anybody would lightly weigh. You begin to run out of cases. You begin to run out of scenarios for major combat deployments of American forces. And that doesn't mean you reduce American combat capability to zero. That's not what we're talking about. It is an appropriate hedge to then rethink how much you need in the ground force, how much of it is active duty, how much it is reserve, how much you exercise it, where you exercise it, and how you're likely to use it. And you do a similar analysis in any mission area that you think is important to American national security. What is the global steaming tempo of the United States Navy? What need it be? What should it be? We've managed to retain global naval superiority for the last 60 or 70 years, even with a shrinking Navy. In large part because no other country is as crazy as we are to develop as large a Navy as we have. So we have the globally dominant Navy, even at its current size. There is no other Navy that comes close, and no Navy within reach within decades. No country that even looks like it has the intentions of going to that length. So if your mission area is global presence at sea, we have and still have and would have in the future global presence in sea. I've already mentioned my own views with respect to counterinsurgency, nation-building exercises in the military. We are structuring, exercising, forming, training our military today in pursuit of DoD Directive 3000.05 and the 24 Doctrine from the United States Army as if we were going to pursue major large-scale insurgency operations on a global basis. If we look at the global scenario, we don't see that as a likely exercise of American military forces. Nay, if anything, it's not likely to be well received given the experiences that we've had in Iraq and Afghanistan. So you set priorities among missions. We think dealing with terrorist organizations, particularly the global al-Qaeda network, is a key priority. Does it demand a large ground force? No. You specifically tailor forces, and we use largely special forces for that threat, to deal with the kinetic edge of what is a broad problem of law enforcement, finances, and military operations, and governance stability in other countries. And so on through the chart. In other words, in each area, a hard-nosed analysis that says, what is the threat, what is the issue, what is the real risk, what are the tools we use, and how do we calculate that risk,
Thank you.
leads you to a strategist's answer, which is some risks are more acceptable than others, and it leads us to the conclusion that on almost all areas that I can think of, 10 years out and $1 trillion less than the more than $6.5 trillion currently projected, we still have a globally dominant military in every threat area I can imagine.
Mr. Chairman, this is the third or fourth time that my good friend and colleague on this panel has criticized the Perry Hadley
Hold on,
panel.
just hold on.
Nobody's asked me for a response to that. Am I going to have an opportunity just to?
Senator
I feel Bill
Talent?
Perry and Steve Hadley be very upset if I don't say something.
You want to let me do this? Senator Talent, I do concur on that one. I'm going to put us back on schedule with a 5-minute clock on it, just for all those future that are coming up on it, because we're bumping up against noon in a hurry, and I know several schedules are against that. I have the first series of questions at this point, and I will defer to you to begin my time, and we will honor with the 5-minute time.
And I'll try and do it quickly. Look, we did a strategic analysis. The whole first chapter was about a grand strategy, because you do define what you need in terms of defense, in terms of what your foreign policy objectives are. So we set forth what we thought the enduring national interests and objectives of the United States were, based on the strategic habits on a bipartisan basis of the presidents of the last 4 years, identified the 5 threats, and decided what force structure would be necessary to meet them. We knew we were resource constrained. The force structure we recommended specifically says, look, it would be nice to increase the size of the Army and the Marines, but that's not the top priority. The top priority is increasing the size of the Navy and recapitalizing the whole force. There's this specific understanding that resources are not unlimited. Now, Mr. Adams, with his usual eloquence and civility, talks about the strategic analysis they've done instead of math. Later on, you heard him, though, in what he said, describe what strategic analysis really is, which is basically, look, tell them what their budget ceiling is, subject them to some pain, and force them to make some hard choices. In other words, it's a budget-driven type process. Now, he talked about risks that are extremely unlikely. What you're seeing with that analysis is 2 things that happen all the time. One, an assumption, without talking about it very much, is just assuming risks away. You're going to say, well, we're not going to have to do insurrection again, put a large number of troops on the ground. Exactly what they said in the 1990s. They cut the force then. We had to put them on the ground, and it created a huge number of costs. And the other is the assumption that you know more than you can know throughout the planning horizon. We're talking about planning 10, 20 years down the road. The world is an unstable place. So yes, you have to be resource constrained, but you have to understand what you don't know. And as Secretary Rumsfeld said one time, what the unknowns are as well. And I thank you for giving me the opportunity.
No, I understand. A well-equipped military personnel, as far as a well-equipped, well-trained and well-equipped, becomes a large part of our edge worldwide, and has been in many of our conflicts.
We tend to get hit where we're not prepared.
Well, I understand. That's part of the frustration, though, weapons procurement systems. That's where we tend to see large cost overruns at times. There's also a balance of experimenting. We know with a new drug being formed, sometimes they go down a long way and it ends up being a dead end and doesn't work. And they lose a lot of money in the process. It's just very painful when we do that in the public eye with the modernization system. We also have a frustration right now with the number of times that Guard and Reserve members are headed back with their 3rd or 4th tour. The way we've cut back on active duty, that now we're very dependent on a very protracted war that we did not expect 10 years ago, that now we are deeply into, and we have people that have private lives as well as public service in that are being asked to serve again and again and again in these different tours. Let me come back to a couple of questions on this in the 2 minutes that I have. How do we create some incentives for efficiency? We've talked about it several times, whether it be in modernizing weapons and procurement systems. Give me a 1-2 of the low-hanging fruit of how do we create an incentive for efficiencies in some of these systems. Type of contract, way the contract's overseen, the frequency of contracts, whatever it may be. Anyone can jump in, but they need to be brief.
Look, I think that the people responsible at the top, I mean, they have their weapons programs that they like, and you have to exercise control, because like the Air Force always wants fighters. Okay, it doesn't mean you don't need fighters. But I think they have an incentive. I mean, they don't want the cost overruns, because it undermines the credibility of the program and means they can buy fewer platforms and have fewer programs. But I think what they are failing to do, and I've said this several times, I don't think anybody here is really disagreeing with this either. They're failing to establish clear chains of command, empowering people in line management, and then giving them the responsibility and the authority to keep these programs on budget and on time. The other thing is they're trying to get too much capability in many cases with platforms, instead of settling for something incremental and getting it out into the field.
Okay, Dr. Adams, can I ask you a quick question as well? You referred earlier to private and versus commercial, that you're saying that there are some folks that are military uniformed that should be more commercial, I think was the term that you used on that. Can you expand on that?
They're performing essentially commercial functions. That is to say, they're doing things that you would do in the private sector, in the economy, rather than things that which you would do in the Department of Defense. The answer to that is not necessarily, however, to convert 100,000 people to private sector entrepreneurs. Because as I said earlier, it's mission related. You can shrink the entire infrastructure, and that'd be one place to target in shrinking the entire
You're
infrastructure.
saying take that task, not say, 10 people did it in military, it needs to be 10 people over here, but
Right.
that task needs to be pushed over and they bid it out for a cheaper amount.
Exactly. It's not necessarily, the argument is not necessarily one for privatization. It is some of those functions when you've shrunk the mission set and focused on the risks, is you may not require a lot of those functions to be performed.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Ryan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Talent, Senator, I was interested in what you were saying. The military equals stability, which equals economic growth, and for example, up in the North Korea region. One of the issues I know I have, and I think a lot of people on this committee have, and I think a lot of people in the country have, is they see us spending hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in the military. And compared to 30 or 40 years ago, in industrial towns like the one I come from in Youngstown, Ohio, and throughout the industrial Midwest, we seem to be seeing less and less of that money being spent and driven back into the economy of the United States.
Right.
And so, not only, as I think Mr. Mulvaney said about auditing, and it seems like you're even saying that 10 to 15 billion a year would be great if we could get to that number in savings. So I have two issues. One is we're spending a lot of this military money in Northwest Pacific area, as you stated, and now we're going to sign trade agreements with South Korea. We have huge globalization, which has put thousands of Americans out of work, and yet those people are still paying taxes to fund the military to have the economic stability so that we can have a global economy, although it's kept their wages stagnant for 30 years. So there's a level of frustration in the country when we're spending all of this money and we're not seeing it driven back into the manufacturing defense industrial base in the United States of America. So 4% of the GDP is a big number, but many of us here advocate for increases in transportation, for example, where we're at 1, maybe 2% of the GDP when China and India are at 9 or 10 or 11% of their GDP.
Mm-hmm.
And back in the day, we were at 8, 9% of our GDP. So we need to figure out how we are going to, one, get this money driven back into the United States. So, because we're also advocating for transportation, and that puts our building trades right back to work.
Mm-hmm.
How do we go about doing that? How do we figure out how we start bringing some of this economic stability to benefit average people in Youngstown, Ohio?
I agree. I mean, look, I was a huge advocate for infrastructure, by the way, when I was in your side of the table. And I think when you have a debt problem, you have to do two things. You have to decide where you don't want to spend, and you have to decide where you do continue to need to spend in order to support the economy so that you can get out of the debt situation.
So
I think I said
you
this
believe
before.
investments should be made.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think, but
That's
part of the
always case
problem here
I
is,
just want to clarify.
yeah, part of the problem is that when you have hugely increased deployments, which we've had in the last 20 years, you have a reduced force in terms of number of personnel. You're not buying the platforms, the equipment, the ships, planes that they need, and you're not modernizing. You get huge amounts of stress, which costs money. This is basically the reason that the operation and maintenance budget has gone up, and then that has deprived procurement and modernization of the funding that it needs. And I think we're all in agreement that that's a problem. We have different opinions about how it happened and what we should do about it. One of the things I used to say all the time when I was in your position, and people ask me, what do we do for manufacturing and manufacturing jobs? I said, well, one consensus thing, I think it could be a robust defense manufacturing base.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just we get jobs
we
that
all,
way.
We all agree with that, but that's not the case. These companies take a lot of their work offshore. They're spending a lot of money in other countries. The Berry Amendment's got a loophole so big you can, drive an Abrams tank through it. And, it's just this problem that we've been having. I know the 9 years I've been here have been trying to deal with it. And it's going to be very difficult for anybody to advocate for 4% of the GDP being spent on the defense industrial base when we know that money is not going into RTI Titanium in Niles, Ohio. It's going to a Russian company, for example. And these examples are, everywhere. So, I think we've got to clear that up. And the second point I'd just like to make, and have you give a brief comment on it, because we only have 30 seconds. It seems to me that
You all are
this,
very disciplined on this committee.
We're about to be.
yeah, I mean, the guy who waits around for an hour and a half gets squeezed, Anyway, the people making the money in the United States, the big corporations who benefit from this military investment and stabilization, I believe should be helping us pay for these investments. And I don't think it's a big sacrifice to say go back to the Clinton-era levels for the top 1% who will benefit from this military investment, who will benefit from the economic stability, and who will benefit from the global trade. Quickly, if you can.
Well, I'm here to talk about defense issues. I have my opinion about other fiscal policies. I'd rather not. Heritage has written a lot about the tax situation. I would say to you, I'll take the Heritage and panel hat off and just say as Jim Talent, I mean, my concern about the tax situation is that, well, what we all want is more tax revenue, but that doesn't necessarily mean higher tax rates. And there is a link between the rate of taxation and the actual economic growth. I mean, there's an awful lot of research. I'm going into dangerous waters here because I'm certainly not expert, that shows no matter what you do with the tax system, you get about 18.5% of the GDP and revenue to the government. So if you increase taxes, the danger is you don't get higher revenue and you do get fewer jobs.
Well,
and this is something that I would hope you all would talk about. That was just me.
I would just say it seems like there's a major service being provided here for the multinational corporations that take advantage of these sea lanes and the protection of the United States Navy and the stability that's provided in Asia. That's a service that the government's providing, and I believe it's not inappropriate for us to ask them to help us continue this.
Well, we can agree that everybody ought to pay their fair share.
Thank you.
Then we are in agreement.
Thank you, Mr.
On
Young.
that end.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
All right, I think we're on. First, thank you to all our panelists. It's been a fascinating discussion here, and as a member of not just the Budget Committee, but of the Armed Services Committee, let me share with you the perspective of a freshman member of Congress. Within days of being sworn in, you can imagine we're asked to make all manner of different platform sort of decisions. Expeditionary fighting vehicle, fund or defund. If you're going to fund, do you decrease the funding? Next decision. Two engines or one engine for this aircraft platform. Next decision. There's no strategic context to so many of these decisions articulated by the administration. This is not meant to be partisan. These challenges go back a number of years, a number of administrations. We have to find some way out of this. Now, both Senator Talent and Dr. Adams, you to your credit, I think did discuss the strategic implications of investing more or investing less in our military. I wish our administration could articulate the same sorts of things, and I would like perhaps a discussion for another day to get into some of the mission discipline concerns, or perhaps we need less discipline. I think there are probably intelligent and intelligible arguments that say, no, we're not committed enough in certain areas, and we need to invest further. I'm frankly open to both arguments, okay? But they need to be made, and the administration is just not doing it. Now, there's a $400 billion defense savings initiative that our current president has launched. And Dr. Adams, I saw you quoted recently, perhaps out of context. We know how that happens around here. But, quote, this review is going too fast to mean something, is what the press indicated you had said. And I share those concerns, that perhaps it's going too fast to very critically look at what our grand strategy should be as a country, what our role should be in the world. That, of course, should drive what missions we're asking our military to perform. We ought then prioritize each of those respective missions. That, in turn, should drive our force structure. our R&D decisions. Along the way, let's cut out the waste and inefficiency. There's certainly opportunities to do so, and I'm open to that. The question is this: how, absent choosing some dollar figure, $400 billion of cuts, to enforce some discipline on our bureaucracy, absent that, how can we get the Pentagon, the administration, to articulate what our role should be in the world and all the other things that fall beneath? Do we need to scrap the QDR and replace it with something else? Do we need to just improve the QDR? Or are we left with this very uncomfortable situation where we are asking managers of our military, of our Pentagon, to manage down to a dollar figure? Something I'm entirely comfortable doing, frankly, in the USDA, but less comfortable doing in DOD. I'll give Dr. Adams about 2 minutes to answer that, followed by Senator Talent.
Happy to take a crack at it. It's a very big and I think very important question. We over the past 30 or 40 years, and particularly over the past 20, have basically allowed administration after administration, whether it's Democrat or Republican, to get away with having the Department of Defense be the primary strategic planner for the United States government when it comes to our international engagement. It's quite stunning when you think about it. Until this past year, there has not been a strategic planning document of any kind from the Department of State, the Agency of International Development, and while there's been a national security strategy from the White House, it has followed, most of the time, the Defense Department strategic planning document, not preceded it. So we have allowed it to happen. And just as a bracket, I want to say it so that Senator Talent doesn't think I disagree with him on everything. I think while I disagreed with the content, the strategic planning document that the Bush White House did, the first one they did, was a masterpiece of strategic thinking. It was actually quite good. I disagreed with its thrust, but they actually prioritized what they thought was important and deprioritized what they thought was less important.
Which Bush White House?
The Bush White House. Oh, the second Bush White House. The second Bush White House. Thank you. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. The other part of it, as I said in my earlier remarks, I'm not sure whether you were here yet or not, Congressman, was that resources and strategy are always related. So strategy, where's the dollar sign, as Bernard Brody said, it's always resource constrained, so you plan with that knowledge in mind. You don't plan with it absent from your mind. You know, therefore, that you can never reduce risk everywhere all the time to zero. You have to prioritize your risks and capabilities.
Mr. Chairman, if I can have 30 seconds to allow Senator Talent to respond.
Look, I agree very much with what you're saying. I think this is something Gordon and I agree on. The lack of strategic clarity. I wrote a huge article on this. The lack of direction from the highest level of civilian authority since the Cold War ended, through now almost 4 presidents, is extremely frustrating. What we had to do in the Perry-Hadley Commission is to look at what they had actually done from administration to administration and deduce from that what we call the strategic habits of the United States, and to deduce from that the interests and objectives that we would needed to defend. So
I guess the counterpoint would be, should those habits change? And I look forward to that robust dialogue. But
and one other thing, I don't think DOD is hungering to do deployments out there. That has never been. I mean, they're not saying they really want the deployments reduced.
Sure.
And I agree with him also, with Gordon also. It's been a default thing because we have not planned it. We have not had clarity. We have sent troops in because we don't prepare anything else. So, I agree very much with that comment, and I think a hearing on that would be great.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you.
Terrific.
Thank you. Recognize Mr. Skapter for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, welcome. And I want to associate myself with Mr. Amash's remarks. There are discussions going on inside DOD right now about, well, in terms of threat levels, what is the role of the Marine Corps in the 21st century? I think that a hearing on their perceptions of the threat and then following suit on systems makes a great deal of sense, because often systems seem to lead us rather than a connection to the threat level. I also want to associate myself with Mr. Ryan's remarks in terms of outsourcing with the F-35 and the amount we're going to expend on that. I just returned from Italy, visiting some of our bases there, and the amount of outsourcing that is going to go on in that is incredible. And so those of us who represent states where DOD is closing facilities, whether it's the dual sourcing on engines for the F-35, or whether it's the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle. Ohio's hit very hard by that. I'm very much for production in this country, and also very concerned about what I've learned in my career on contractors and the amount that that's costing us, and getting a straight answer out of DOD on how much more we are spending because of this growing reliance on contractors as opposed to insourcing. I hope in your research you'll focus on some of that, because I think each of you is really providing the country with a great service. I just wanted to say, I heard a number yesterday that if we reduced unemployment to 7%, we would cut our deficit in half. That is an astounding number. And I want to focus my remaining short time on those in the military who are returning to us who have no jobs. It is a staggering figure. The post-9/11 veterans, according to data from May of this year, shows the unemployment rate was 12.1%. For younger male veterans aged 18 to 24, 26.9%. And they're coming back to places like I represent, where the unemployment rate has been way over the national average. The suicide rate corresponds to what is happening there. What they're facing with the foreclosure rate and so forth in our parts of the country are truly very difficult. And so my question to you really has to do with, how do we are wasting an enormous amount of human capital in these returning veterans. And how would we better position these returning vets in readjustment to capture their talents and to get them reemployed in the work that you're doing, especially where they're coming back into economically distressed areas? How can we leverage the skills of our returning service members to improve outcomes for them who've served us, and to gain useful assets for our country, and providing a better outcome across the board? It seems DOD drops them, and the VA doesn't really completely pick them up. What do we do in order to reduce this unemployment level and focus on this large pool, 232,000 veterans, 250,000 veterans, just since post 9/11, that are out there unemployed?
Let me take a first crack at that, Congressman, because I think it's a very important question. The issue for me has always come down to push versus pull. There are obviously government programs that we can do that help people try to adjust, transfer skills, move into employment, and so on. That's a push side. My sense, though, is that the history of base closures, which is a proxy here for what I'm about to say, is that the demonstrated evidence from base closures is the most successful transition for communities and institutions and businesses and people who work in communities when a base closes, is the health of the local economy. The best thing that we can do, in my judgment, to get people like that employed and use their skills is if we focus on restoring the health of the American economy, because that's going to create the context in which employers want to hire them, have money that they can hire them with, are going to provide them with opportunities. So you need both a push and a pull approach. You can't push them out into a non-pulling economy.
I hear what you're saying, but it isn't working fast enough.
Right, I understand that.
Right, and it's a real problem.
Understood.
In communities across this country. Yes?
A concrete suggestion, DOD is, I assume they're doing, because they're supposed to do when veterans leave, an examination of their baseline medical conditions. They're supposed to do that when they come in and then also when they leave. Almost an exit type of thing. Now there's an opportunity, and I would think you might be able to do this at very little cost, to sort of expand that to talk to them about their employment profile, you know, their ambitions, their skills, et cetera, so that you get that. And then, now I don't think DOD should continue. Then you need to hand that off either to VA or labor, and you've got a good profile there and some guidance for that individual and some opportunities. So you may want to ask what DOD is doing when people leave, what they ask, what kind of suggestions they make to them, because they've got them at that point.
Senator, if I use their medical exam as any indicator of how we should deal with unemployment and reemployment of these vets, I wouldn't want to trust DOD on it.
Yeah, I worked on that issue with Senator Clinton when I was in the Senate, but it's been like 4 years, so I'm not aware of they're supposed to be doing that better. But that, you asked, and that was the only concrete suggestion I had.
Right. I know that my time is up, but I just wanted to say I hope I've sensitized you to this issue. It is a serious, serious problem. And I can also say, Mr. Chairman, in closing, that for instance, if they try to go to community colleges to use their GI benefits, there are many of them. They cannot concentrate in normal classes. This subset of our society, this is the new America. They're coming home to us, and they're out there. They're alone many times. They don't group like the World War II vets. They're in our homeless shelters. They're in our food lines. This is not the way to treat America's returning vets. Some group of intelligent people has to help us keep a focus on this subset of our population. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Adams, I know that you have an appointment that's coming up soon. You feel free to be able to step out when you need to. We had asked you to be able to stay through noon, and obviously it's 10 after at this point.
Right.
And
I'm
so if you
gonna
need
have
to
to
be
leave shortly. Thank you.
If you need to be able to slip out, feel free to be able to do that. I'm glad to be able to have all of you in your time here. With that, I recognize Mr. McClintock for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Afraid I had missed the last hour, so if you have already covered this, just tell me so and we'll move on. Yeah, I agree with Ronald Reagan that defense is not a budget issue. You spend what you need to spend in order to defend your country. If you fail to do that, you end up without a country. But that doesn't mean that you spend more than you need to spend. So if I could ask Mr. Talent, Mr. Adams, just in a minute's overview, what do we need that we don't have, and what do we not need that we do have?
Well, I've offered some sense, I think, in the hearing so far of what I think we don't need and can probably do without and safely build down to, given the fact that, as I said earlier, 10 years out and 15% fewer resources, we will still have the world's dominant military. Now, there are a lot of specifics inside that about that I would recommend some things up and some things down, but I think that's dominant. It's interesting, though, that you do cite President Reagan, because President Reagan did have that view. And when Grab-Run-Hollings passed, he learned that indeed defense is in part a resource issue, that resources do constrain our defenses. And the history that we had of 1985 to 1998 was that our defense resources, along with most federal spending, went down as part of the Graham-Rudman-Hollings and then Budget Enforcement Act deficit reduction exercise.
I agreed with your earlier analysis, which is you don't set a budget number and then figure out what you can buy with it. You figure out what you need and then adjust your budget number to meet those needs.
Well, I think you actually do both. It's interactive. Yeah. Strategy wears a dollar sign, as I said earlier.
Mr. Talent, any thoughts?
Well, look, on a very practical level, and what I've recommended is we have to increase the size of the Navy. It's about 285 now. It's headed down because there's a 30-year average life of the ships, and we're buying 6 or 7 a year. And you can figure out that means we're going down. Now, the Perry Hadley panel recommended a bottom-up review. The bottom-up review force structure, this came out in 1993. I think it was 340 ships or so, and to increase shipbuilding, try and get us up to there. That was the force structure. It was Les Aspen's force structure that the government thought we needed in the 90s. This was before the global war against terrorism or whatever it is you want to call them. So I think increasing the size of the Navy and then recapitalizing the equipment in the rest of the force, because it's impossible to have an armed services where people are flying or driving and trying to maintain and keep in place, inventories that are 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years old, and that's what's driving up your O&M costs. So, and I would just say this, you mentioned Reagan, and getting that done as quickly as possible is going to save you money. And not doing it's going to cost you more money. And that's the history, really, of the last 15 years.
Well, let me ask you a couple of questions that have been bothering me about, what we're paying for that we probably don't need. And one of them, screams out is why we're paying to defend Europe from the Soviet Union 20 years after the Soviet Union ceased to exist.
We should not be, it's my view, we should not be maintaining commitments abroad primarily to serve somebody else. This should be designed to protect America's vital interests. Now, the Perry Hadley Commission recognized 4 enduring national interests we need to defend. One is defense of the homeland, which is increasingly a challenge in an age of asymmetric weapons. The second is freedom of the commons, the air, the sea, the space, all directly related to our economy and our quality of life. A preservation of an acceptable non-totalitarian balance of power in the Eurasian space. And if you look at where we have been involved in the last, really, 60 years, but in the last 20 years, just look at it. It's from Korea, the Western Pacific, Southern Asia, et cetera, because of a sense that if that spins out of control somehow, it's going to affect American security negatively. And then fourth was the provision of a kind of humanitarian sort of goods to people, at least
But
participating in the delivery
Isn't
system.
that Europe's responsibility with respect to Europe and its area of influence and interest?
I don't believe, I mean, personally, I think we can discuss what the European allies ought to be doing that they're not doing. And this question came up, how do we get the allies to take more of a burden? Yes, it would be great. But the precondition to that is a belief that the United States is going to remain committed. Because if we don't remain committed and we're not showing leadership, they're much less likely to step up than they are to try and come to a deal with the Russians, who invaded Georgia 2 years ago.
I can't get to this final question, but I'd appreciate your directing me where I can get more information on it, and that's the subject that you brought up, procurement. How is it that we end up ordering new weapon systems without setting aside the dollars necessary not only to meet our needs, but also to assure that we can obtain these copies at an affordable per-copy price?
Yeah, because as all of us, I think, agree, the procurement system is in many respects screwed up. And I would, on this subject, certainly, I'd advise, I'd suggest the members of the committee that they take the time to read the chapter in here. I don't think the chapter on procurement reform is one that anybody would disagree with on a philosophical point of view. And I thought it was very powerful, and I really didn't have any hand in it. It was the people on the panel who had done this, I mean, really savvy type veterans of this system. And it sure makes a lot of sense to me. And that is one of the things I think we're all in agreement we need to do and do as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Florida is recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've heard in this committee over the last number of months, many of our Republican colleagues espouse the need to slash discretionary spending and Medicare as we know it and direct some pretty painful cuts. Knowing that 60% of our discretionary budget goes to the Defense Department, if we couch defense as a sacred cow that is untouchable, then everything is a sacred cow. Because, Mr. Senator Talent, you've criticized the president for proposing $400 billion in defense cuts, and I think you said at the time that defense spending isn't the cause of our deficits, and that those cuts would not make a large difference in reducing the deficit.
I think I said it was fantasy to propose that, but
okay, so that's even stronger.
Right.
So
if I didn't say that, I said it in the first draft and then took it out later.
You're underscoring what I'm suggesting that you said, rather than running from it. The defense budget makes up 1/5 of the entire federal budget, and I mean we've got bipartisan consensus that we're going to have to put sacred cows on the table in order to make a dent in the deficit. By your logic, would you argue that non-defense discretionary spending should also be excluded from a deficit reduction? Because that's even less. That's even more of a drop in the bucket. And further, let me finish my question, please.
Oh, I'm sorry.
By the same logic, conversely, would you argue that more revenue should be part of the solution? Because that's an area in which we can, if significance in terms of the impact on deficit reduction is your marker, it would seem to me that you should be for putting revenue on the table and for making sure that we can address this effort in a significant way, and against things that aren't significant, like slashing indiscriminately discretionary non-defense revenue, which, like you said, is a drop in the bucket.
Yeah. All right. Let me. I thank you, and I'm sorry to interrupt. And by the way, before the hearing closes, I want to apologize to Mr. Van Hollen because I insisted on giving him more answer than he gave me question on a couple of
Your
points.
apology is cutting into my 5 minutes.
Oh,
if you would.
okay. I keep forgetting how disciplined you are. Okay, on defense, my concern here is that if you underfund basic capabilities that are needed to deal with risks that are not going to go away, you end up causing a whole lot more in expenditures than you save. I think a classic example is when the government cut the size of the Army in the 1990s in the belief, which I think was a budget-driven belief, that we would not have to put large numbers of troops on the ground. It meant that we could not prosecute the Afghanistan and Iraq.
So let me just ask you, so your point was not that we shouldn't touch defense, we just shouldn't indiscriminately touch it.
Right, and we should put the savings back into things that we do need.
So criticizing, so the criticism of the president's $400 billion in proposed cuts isn't general criticism? Was it specific as to what he was proposing
Because
to
he
cut?
said, well, he didn't say what he was proposing. I prefer the president's approach of the last several years, which is, because part of this, to be frank, is the president arguing with himself, because his own administration proposed at least modest real increases in the defense budget until that speech. So, and he hasn't been specific about what he wants to do.
Well,
I have no problem with finding savings, but I don't want to cut the top line. Find the savings and then put it into the things that we need to put it into.
You would retreat from your statement that we shouldn't touch defense because it doesn't cause the deficit. It isn't a significant impact on the deficit, and so therefore it should be untouchable.
With respect, I never said defense was untouchable. I said the savings that we can achieve in defense, we should put back into things that we need more within the
That's not
department's
what
budget.
I have you on the record as saying, from what I understand. Let me just ask Mr. Mosher a question. We're spending nearly $50 billion a year on military retirement benefits, and if we direct your attention to that chart up there, there have been a lot of defense analysts, including people who served on including the conclusions of the QR, whatever the acronym is, Quadrennial Review of Military Compensation, who've criticized the current system as not being fair or efficient. You can only collect military retirement benefits unless you're disabled after serving 20 years. And we have that means that most of the individuals deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, including many in my district, who aren't going to get any retirement benefits because, as you can see, they really only were serving for 4, 5, 6 years. So to me, that doesn't seem fair, especially given that members of Congress, congressional staff, law enforcement officers, firefighters can accrue pension benefits after 5 years. We accrue them after 6. So is the current retirement system for the military fair and efficient? And if not, how could we make it better?
I can't speak to fairness and efficiency. We haven't analyzed that in any detailed way. What I can say is that there have been numerous proposals over the decades to try to change the military, the military retirement system, and there are defenders on both sides. You know, there are advantages, as you point out, what that's called cliff vesting. You don't get anything until you reach 20 years, except for some disability cases. And so you cliff vest, and that creates an incentive for people to leave afterwards, right, sooner than you might want them otherwise. And for folks, particularly in those first 10 years of service, it tends not to entice them to stick around for that pension. You know, once they get beyond 10 years, then people tend to stick around because they're a little older, pension means more, and it's closer to them.
It's worth it for them.
It becomes worth it to them. But that's the way the system's designed, and there are pros and cons to it. And what you say is absolutely true. People who don't serve the 20 years don't get the money, and a lot of people enlist and then leave. I mean, often it's a choice on their part. They don't want the military life. You could do something that would be like a TSP system, which would be sort of a hybrid, a small defined benefit program in FERS and then a contributory program. You could do something that would be like the old CSRS system, which was the federal system where you had a defined benefit only. You didn't have to worry about the state of the market at the time. Or you could have something that was much more like a 401k that many people have in the private sector. But all those have advantages and disadvantages, and I guess the right people to talk about this would be the folks at DOD who could talk about, there's a force management issue as well. There's an equity issue, clearly, but there's also if I'm the managers of personnel in DOD, how is it that I ensure that I get the force structure that I want, that has the capabilities that I want, that has the pyramid structure that I want, because as you move up in rank, there are fewer and fewer people at those ranks, and it's a very complicated discussion. But yes, clearly there are people who have argued that it needs to be changed, and there are people who have argued that it has some advantages.
But the point and the concern is that there's quite a bit of sacrifice without really anything to show for it at the end, other than...
In terms of a pension, you're absolutely correct.
Yeah. Thank you. You're back.
Thank you. Mr. Van Hollen has a quick question.
I can't get, there we go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. About 3 minutes ago, the chairman turned to me and said, do I have any closing statements? I said no, and that was until Senator Talent that you mentioned that the president's $400 billion in proposed defense spending cuts was, quote, fantasy. I would just point out that if that is your standard, I would ask you to look at the members of the President's Bipartisan Fiscal Commission. The President proposed $400 billion over 12 years. which would allow the current defense budget to grow at the rate of inflation. The Bipartisan Commission recommended $1 trillion of cuts. So by the standard that $400 billion over 12 years is fantasy, I'm assuming that you put such individuals like Senator Coburn, Senator Crapo, former Senator Craig, Senator Domenici in the land of the totally delusional. We've got to get serious about our budget deficit. To say that 20% of our budget is a trivial contribution to that national effort, I think neglects the very important duties that we have. And I'll just end by where we started. I agree with you that our defense spending has to be driven by strategy. We've had that conversation. That's why I think putting an artificial GDP percentage on it is math and not strategy. Part of that strategy requires the United States to retain the economic power and full potential that it has. If we do not deal with this deficit and debt, as the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has said, we will all be in a world of hurt, and that will hurt our military, and it will hurt the ability of the United States to project its interests, power, and values around the world. And so I just ask you to, when we throw away around phrases like fantasy for $400 billion, put that in the context of what bipartisan commissions have recommended. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Talon, did you want to make a quick response to that? Seems direct.
Well, I think it is fantasy to believe that we can cut that much out of the defense budget over the next 10 years and protect American security within an acceptable margin of risk. That happens to be my view, strongly stated. I understand that the members and the people you talked about disagree. I do think that the Simpson-Bowles report, as far as it referred to defense spending, was budget-driven rather than strategic-driven. Now, as far as the administration is concerned, I certainly meant no disrespect. I do think this is a situation where the administration in its first 2 years has been proposing, and I thought this was not everything we needed to do, but it was partly, modest real increases in the defense budget. And now the President has unveiled this idea of cutting the defense budget over the next 10 years. So I think it's an internally inconsistent position. And, I mean, if I were still on the HASC and I had officials of the DOD in front of me, I would say, well, if this new position is right, then does that mean the old one was wrong? And if the old position was right, does that mean the new one is wrong? But I appreciate what you're saying, and I agree with much of it. And now I get a chance to apologize personally to you for, like I said, giving you more answer than you gave me.
No apologies necessary on that front, Senator. Thank you both for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And we are still waiting on the details of what that $400 billion cut is over the next decade. And so that's part of the ongoing pursuit of this as well, is one to recommend it, but it's another one to be able to get the details of that. Obviously, defense spending is fallen dramatically over the last 50 years. In the percent of the federal budget and what we're doing, but it's just a matter of being judicious with that process. So I do appreciate y'all coming and being a part of the panel today. With that, we are adjourned.
I've appreciated CBO's work, and usually, in this field, consistently honest, within the limits of what you're doing, assessment, and quoted you many times. Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry.